Part 12. The Hound of the Baskervilles. March had turned into April, and refreshing news had been making its way to me regarding the war. I knew in my heart that good would triumph over evil, and I do believe that it was resulting in the improvement of my health. Or perhaps it was the healthy excitement that I got whilst assisting my new friend with his daily business. As a child, I never had much in the way of true excitement, almost always encouraged to stay safely at home. There had been the occasional hunting trip with my father, and I had attended some social events during college at Nanny's insistence, even made a few friends during those. But overall, I had been someone who kept out of the thick of things. One might assume that going to war would only strengthen those isolationist tendencies, as it did for some. But Mr. Holmes prevented that. He tried to ensure that I went out on a regular basis to socialize. Thanks to this, I was content enough to trust his word during most occasions when he said I should stay home. There was one occasion, however, in which he told me to stay home, and I didn't listen. Had I done as instructed, it would have left the guilt of a man's death squarely upon Holmes' shoulders. It began on one of those days that I had been left to my own devices, having once more finished my copywork and being of little use to Wells. Mary, still being only 5 months pregnant, needed little in the way of looking after, so I busied myself playing with the little pups of Mrs. Hudson's terrier, thinking that I had found myself alone. I managed to get myself on the floor beside them, and became engaged in that horrid habit of baby talk that so many of the fairer sex plague ourselves with. Now, I am firmly of the opinion that if you want a dog to understand your commands, then you must speak to them in a regulated, normal tone as much as possible. That being said, I also hold the opinion that baby-talking puppies does little harm, provided they also hear you speak normally. Thus, on the floor of the mudroom, surrounded by puppies, is where I was found by the Holmes brothers, who wished to have a word with me.
"Oh, aren't you just the cutest little thing? Yes, you are, you absolute baby, sweet pea snooky pie. Yes, you are, with your little paws and earies. Yes, you little snooky pooky poo."
I was unceremoniously startled by a flash of light going off, and abruptly looked up to see the Holmes brothers. Mycroft looked distinctly amused, while Holmes held a small camera and looked down at me with an alarming grin. Realization of what just happened dawned in my mind, and I did my best to put the puppies back in their box and stand.
"Sherlock Holmes, so help me, if you develop that photograph, I will never forgive you."
Holmes, unperturbed by my threat, just smiled wider. "I think I can live with that, Watson. You're so soft-hearted that never really means you'll be cross for about 20 minutes. Crossing my arms, I looked at Mycroft in supplication, who merely stared back at me amused. Realizing I was out of my depth, I sighed. "Well, just send a copy to my uncle, then, if you must keep it." Mycroft smiled. "We just wanted to invite you out. Rather, Sherlock wanted to invite you out. I have a rather sensitive meeting that I need to hold, and the fewer people within earshot, the better." I nodded. "Of course, just let me get my hat and coat." We were well down the road before I thought to ask Holmes what we were doing. "Where are we going, anyway?" Holmes responded, clearly suppressing laughter. "Well, Pookie Snookums, we are going to a concert held in the name of patriotism." My eye twitched, and I bit my lips. I knew well that reacting in any way to his jab would only result in more, and he had a far quicker wit than I. "I see, but why didn't you just send me off with Jonathan? Wouldn't you want to take part in the meeting?" A look of disgust was suddenly etched onto his features. "Watson, Mycroft's meeting is political in nature. I do my best to stay out of such situations when I can." I pondered this. Given what he had told me about his preferred work situation, it made sense that he only did what was strictly necessary for his government, preferring instead to help his people. I stopped walking, and Holmes, ever aware of his surroundings, paused so that I wouldn't be dragged along. "Wait, what kind of concert plays at 10 o'clock in the morning?" It was a bar. Of all places, he had brought me to a bar. The smell of cigarette ash filled the room, lingering with the smell of stale alcohol. "Holmes, why did you bring me here? I had asked too late. Holmes had abandoned me, disappearing into some unknown corner. There were a few people hanging around with instruments in tow. None were drinking yet, and I walked over to the bar, seeing as the grizzled old bartender looked the most friendly. "So you're Stacy's friend. He wasn't kidding that you don't look like much." Confusion ran throughout me as I contemplated the man's words. Then, like a church bell ringing the hour, I realized that Holmes had given this man a false name. Yes, sir." The barkeep gave me a funny look, then laughed heartily. "I heard that you Americans use 'sir' funny, but I never heard it before until now. Do you drink, or are you one of those prohibition women I've read about?" I shook my head. "Neither. I have no issue with others drinking, but I'm not really a fan of beer." That seemed to be the best answer, because he simply nodded his old white head. "Fair enough, lassie, but I don't have much here for you if you don't drink. Although—" He paused, stroking his chin thoughtfully, then leaned across the counter conspiratorially, motioning me in. "Would you like some cider? I have some from last year. You can't tell anyone about it, though. It's my own personal stash, guaranteed not to overwhelm you." I looked into the sincere eyes of the old man and smiled. I would not turn down his generosity, especially since I was not one of those anti-alcohol zealots who called for complete prohibition of alcohol in the United States. Even so, my personal feelings on the stuff did mean I was unlikely to drink much. I had, on occasion, imbibed with Nanny and the few friends I had made whilst in college before heading to medical school. At the time, I had had a rather surprising tolerance for alcohol, but on this day I had neglected to consider that perhaps my reduced weight would affect that tolerance. Now, I did not get drunk, I assure you. I had only one mug of cider. But as alcohol tends to do, I had been ridden of those pesky inner voices that tell you when it is a bad idea to do something. Having been abandoned by Holmes, with no idea when I could return to the household, I very quickly became fast friends with the barkeep, who then gave me access to the piano which had been covered with the cloth. Now Holmes, or Stacy, apparently, had not been lying to me. There was indeed a bit of an informal concert about to go on, and the barkeep somehow convinced me that it was my national duty to show Britain how Americans worked the piano. Several pieces later, during which I sobered up and made as graceful an exit as possible to folks' rowdy applause, Stacy met me at the bar, cigarette in hand. "And just where have you been?" I glared and angrily huffed each word. Being abandoned was not something I appreciated, and, while I did know my way back to the house, I had no idea when it would be appropriate to return. Stacy, whom I now realized had mussed hair and was missing his jacket, gazed down at me in amusement. He took a long, slow drag from his cigarette and blew the smoke to the left, which I would later realize was in the direction of airflow to avoid it reaching my face. His gaze then raked over me in a manner that was most unnerving. "Checking the books." I was about to respond to this nonsense when he dropped his beer to the counter, then grabbed me to his side, taking another long drag from his cigarette. So shocked was I at this turn of events that I couldn't bring myself to say a word. "Tony!" Holmes turned to the barkeep. "You make sure my girl's well taken care of, yeah? Whenever she comes in here, I want her to have the best treatment." The barkeep, who was giving Holmes an amused look, nodded. "You got it, boss. Only the best for the future missus." I'm still not entirely certain what transpired between this exchange and our leaving the bar, but, mere moments from exiting, I came to my senses and looked to Holmes, who had at some point fixed his hair and donned his jacket and coat, looking respectable once again. I took a breath before speaking, still flustered and confused.
"What on earth was that?"
It would have been a proper screech if any volume had actually been worked into it. Holmes glanced down at me with that blank stare he sometimes had. "Thomas Stacy's bar. Were you not paying attention, Watson?" I clenched my teeth, biting back a few choice curses.
"No, you oaf! The touching and the my girl bit! You could have at least warned me if you wanted me to play a part!"
I was expecting him to tell me to hush, but still I was fiercely whispering rather than shouting, so I suppose there was no need.
"Also, you own a bar?"
At this point, I was no longer certain what of the situation I could process, so I decided to go with the simplest. A distinct look of amusement came to Holmes' face. "No, Watson, Thomas Stacy owns a bar." I took a deep breath. If I didn't calm down, he would only continue to rile me up. "And you are Thomas Stacy?" Holmes laughed gently.
"Yes."
I tried to unclench my jaw. "I suppose all of the ownership papers are in this Mr. Stacy's name?" He nodded. "Very good, Watson." I pinched the bridge of my nose. "Holmes, I'm fairly certain that's considered fraud, even in criminally minded London." I hadn't intended to insult the city, but being so unnerved I struck a low blow. Holmes seemed to take it in stride, though. "Oh, but it is, though it is only a problem if the government finds out." This was accompanied by a comfortable smile, and I sighed. "And what exactly was the point of bringing me there?" Holmes waved dismissively as he responded. "I had been telling Tony about Stacy's new missus, and he's been wanting to meet her. Mycroft needing you out of the house on the day I was to check the books was pure serendipity." I sent the man a glare. "Serendipity, my foot! He wanted to meet the missus that doesn't exist?" Holmes winked. "As far as Tony's aware, she does now. I may have taken a few liberties with your likeness." After the morning's adventure, I hurried to the sitting room where I had left my work, anxious to sit and crochet. Having finished the shawl, which now spent the majority of its time about Holmes' shoulders, and the scarf about his neck, I had decided to make booties for the baby in order to make something that he could not steal. It wasn't so much that I minded him using the things. After all, I hadn't made them for myself so much as I made them to keep busy. But the yarn was of the highest quality wool, and I was beginning to suspect that he took them because he felt he deserved it. I walked into the room to find the bag I had left there with my things, only to note a strange walking stick in the umbrella stand. Frowning, I picked it up, examining the shaft. It had a silver topper with "To J.M. from the Friends of C.C.H." inscribed. I ran my hands down the black body, noting several tooth marks in the center and a well-beaten tip. The man's dog must have been playing with the thing. But who could have called? No. Who would have been allowed into the house while Mycroft had a meeting in his office? It is not a pleasant thing to realize that one has been had. Stick in hand, I made my way fuming to Mycroft's office, where Holmes was speaking to him. "See, Sherlock, I told you that if you had a visitor she would figure it out in less than 6 minutes." Mycroft's tone was flat as he spoke, after which Holmes handed him a sovereign. I brandished the stick before me as I walked into the room. "Bastard! You lied to me!" I know swearing is unbecoming, but after the morning's adventure, and obviously incomplete explanation, I was thoroughly angered. "If you had wanted me along to play Stacy's missus, you should have asked." I had been waving the stick in Holmes' face, who put a finger on it to avoid getting hit. "But, Watson, I needed to see how you do when taken by surprise. If you are to accompany me on my cases, I need to know what your skills are so I don't send you to your death." He was right. I couldn't deny that. But the soothing, placating tone he spoke in only served to anger me further. "Fine! But if you ever get injured, know that I'm going to take great pleasure in seeing to your wounds." Holmes was unperturbed by the threat, and took the stick, which was still dangerously close to his face. "I look forward to it. Now what is this?" I let go of the stick and huffed. "It's from some client of yours that left. I'm guessing we took too long to return for his comfort." Holmes nodded. "Yes, Watson, but what does the stick tell you?" I glared at him. "I'm here to assist you, Holmes, not do your job for you." Holmes glanced at Mycroft, then back to me. "Humor me, but do talk and walk, so we can leave my poor brother to his work." I fumed out of the office and back to the sitting room, still thoroughly annoyed. "Now, Watson," Holmes followed me into the room as he spoke, "what does this stick tell you?" I gritted my teeth. This man clearly thought he was so much better than everyone else. I should show him. Then I sighed. I had no more fight left in me, so I took the proffered cane and ran my hands over the body of it once more. It is rather new. I would say not more than a few years old. From the state of the wood. The inscription indicates that it is a gift. The ferrule is terribly worn, and the head shines, so he uses it quite regularly. The bite marks are from his dog. My grandfather used the same technique to train his not to run off. I paused, then looked once more at the inscription. I know well the initials CCH and would be utterly stupid not to recognize the Charing Cross Hospital. So your visitor, I would guess, is an old doctor, retired based off of the gift of the cane, does a lot of walking in his retirement, and owns a dog. Is that good enough for you?" I held the stick out to him, and he laughed while taking it. "Oh, Watson, you're so observant, but have no idea how to make use of your observations, and you muddle in information that has nothing to do with the facts at hand." He saw my frown and added to his statement before I could begin to object. "Oh, don't be upset, though. It's like your kind to do so." Incredulity filled me as I stared at the man before me and prepared for some kind of insult. "My kind?" Holmes smiled. "Yes, doctors. At any rate, let me tell you what you got wrong." There were times when I really didn't know what to make of this man, but seeing as I wasn't about to get out of an academic lecture, I settled in. "Now, you are correct that this cane belongs to a doctor, with a dog, but not the old retired man that you make him out to be. Additionally, you are correct that this comes from the Channing Cross Hospital, but that is as far as it goes. You see, Watson, a farrier this beaten could only have been so on country paths." I frowned. "How does that rule out my—" Holmes held out a finger and stared at the stick in his other hand. "Shush, Watson, and listen. This damage indeed indicates that the man does quite a bit of walking, but the bite marks indicate that his dog holds the cane for long stretches. For a retired old man to do enough walking for both to be true is a bit of a stretch, though a doctor, doing regular countryside rounds, would easily do enough walking for both, preferring the dog to carry the stick early in the day while using it for support in the afternoon. Are you following me?" I nodded. "Then surely he must be severely absent-minded if he's young." I paused as I spoke, the realization hitting roughly. If he were old enough to need his stick constantly, he wouldn't have been able to forget it. Holmes, who had paused while waiting for me to understand, grinned. "Excellent, girl! Now, we have an idea of the man, a doctor, young enough to make long rounds in the country on foot, who at one point worked at CCH and keeps a dog. Now we know that his initials are J.M., which means—" He paused and stepped over to the bookshelf where all the latest medical journals and other publications were. I had been meaning to ask why the household even had something like that, but had written it off as being for Jonathan's sake. Now I was not so sure. Holmes pulled a directory from the shelf and flipped through it. "Aha! Here we are. Dr. James Mortimer, author of Frontline Medicine on the Home Front. Residency, Channing Cross Hospital, 1914. And so, Watson, your tottering old man in his retirement becomes a young country doctor with a healthy appreciation for dogs, which, if I am not mistaken, based off of the spacing and the size of the teeth, is a dog of mid-size." He dropped the directory and the cane onto the side table, pausing in thought as he stepped to the window. "Yes, a curly-haired spaniel." For a moment I had thought Holmes crazy when he so definitely named the dog, but then I realized that he had been staring out the window, and it was likely that his visitor had returned for his cane. The visitor was shown up to the sitting room by the maid, and I, still being annoyed, did not stand to greet him. I would come to regret this after a while, as he was quite polite. He came in with hat in one hand and leash in the other. His dog, quite well behaved, padded softly along behind him. Holmes smiled as the man entered the room. "Ah, Dr. Mortimer, please have a seat. Oh, and do have your dog take your stick so that you don't forget it again." Dr. Mortimer's green eyes blinked in confusion, then his fair brow relaxed from the tense state it had been in. "Thank the heavens! I was so afraid that I had lost it elsewhere. I had no idea what I would do without it, as I am quite fond of it." His soft voice combined with his youthful face led me to believe that not only was he not much older than myself, but he likely hadn't seen war. He gave me a worried look, pausing for a moment. "Oh, you're Dr. Watson with the Red Cross, aren't you?" Surprised, I nodded. Yes. How did you know?" Dr. Mortimer stepped towards my chair, excitement showing on his face. "I'm a big fan of Mr. Holmes. I have some friends on the police force who like him, and they tell me stories. The newspaper you were in mentioned your time in Belgium and that you were staying under the care of a noble family during your time here in London. I assumed that since Holmes was staying in his ancestral home and socializing with someone clearly staying here, then you must be the doctor mentioned in the paper." He said it so enthusiastically that I had no heart to call out his poorly thought-out reasoning. He had, at any rate, and only by luck, been right. Holmes looked like he was about to speak, but Dr. Mortimer started again. I do wish I could have joined you in Belgium. I'm sure your work was spectacular, but I'm flat-footed and hadn't the connections to push my way through. They told me I was better off caring for our civilians, so, stubborn as I am, I took up a countryside residence to prove myself able. My feet constantly ache, but I will not back down." All of this was said in that soft, earnest voice, and I couldn't help letting slip a smile. I do love it when someone is passionate about something, and this doctor was clearly passionate about serving. "Do you think you could read my thesis and tell me how it was? I had to form it based on second-hand information, and I'm dying for the opinion of a front-line doctor." I glanced at Holmes, who looked rather annoyed, and adjusted my planned response. "I would love to, Dr. Mortimer, but surely that is not why you came here today, is it?" James Mortimer looked like he had a sudden realization, and he turned back to Holmes. Yes, Mr. Holmes, I am here to get your opinion about a curse." If Holmes' face could turn any more sour, I think it would have curdled, but he responded politely. "Anything outside the realm of the physical is far beyond my reach, Dr. Mortimer. I assume this curse has something to do with the document labeled the Hound of the Baskervilles in your pocket?" Mortimer pulled out the document in question, becoming more agitated. "Yes, you see, it has to do with the death of Sir Charles Baskerville." Holmes drew his fingertips together. Watson and I read about that in the paper. It said he died of heart failure." I sent a scowl his way. It was indeed true that the story had been read. Holmes, for some reason, probably due to some sort of ego complex, had decided to make me read most things out loud to him when we were in the same room. This included any of his sister's novels he caught me reading. I was rather beginning to suspect it was his way of discouraging me from reading the things. It was effective. Dr. Mortimer bit his lip. "Yes, well, I do believe that you will be much better able to understand the situation if you understand the history of the Baskerville family." He was so agitated that I figured it was best to let him continue, but glanced at Holmes to see his reaction. Holmes closed his eyes in the manner which I knew meant he was going to listen and hear more than any other person. "Please proceed, Doctor." Dr. Mortimer cleared his throat and, taking up the document, began to read. Part 13. My sons, I believe it is vital that you learn the terrible history, the truth behind this awful curse which has plagued us for so many years. Some refuse to believe it, others simply ignore it, but the fact of the matter is that the cursed actions of our predecessors have led to grave misfortune for the rest of our family line for all time. It occurred during that terrible war, which was chaos for all of England, but it was not the cause of our troubles. Our ancestor, Hugo Baskerville, was a powerful and conceited man. He defended his land and the people thereupon, and this led him to believe that he was entitled to anything and anyone that dared to live there. He took a girl from her father's home, taking her to his house and locking her up in one of the many rooms therein. What he had done to her before the festivities that were held that evening are known only because of the continued existence of our family line. The festivities continued late into the night, many of our ancestors' comrades becoming thoroughly drunken as the night progressed. The girl, who had been left in a room that had a window, bravely climbed down the rickety trellis that bordered it and stole a horse seeking escape. She may have managed it, had not Hugo Baskerville desired to retire once more to that bedroom in which she was contained. He discovered her escape and theft, swiftly setting out after her. His men followed, and they chased man and girl down upon horseback. It was a storming and chaotic night. As thunder struck and lightning flashed, the men lost sight of their leader rather quickly, but were convinced that their dogs would find them both out upon the moors. They were not entirely wrong. As they came upon one of those hills which bordered the moors, their dogs, which had run ahead, came tearing back toward them, after which they heard a guttural scream and a deep, low howl. The few men brave enough to check what had happened reported seeing the girl cowering in the mud, while a hound with glowing eyes ripped out the throat of our sinister ancestor. It only took one look for those men to run in terror. The hound harmed not the girl, and settled itself with that prey which deserved its fate. The girl returned to her household, but it was too late for her honor. Hugo Baskerville's younger brother, who at the time was barely of age and had a strong distaste for his brother's behavior, made the girl an offer of marriage, which she accepted for her honor's sake. Under them, the Baskerville name became one which has honor and prestige attached to it. But ever since this incident, all the Baskerville men have been careful not to attract the attention of that murderous hound. This history has been passed down to remind all of our sons why we strive to maintain our honor, for if we do not, we will suffer that same fate. Dr. Mortimer finished his story and looked to Holmes. "Well, what do you think?" Holmes, who had on his face that blank look which I had come to know as disdain, opened his eyes. "It is an intriguing fairy tale, Dr. Mortimer, but I fail to see what it has to do with your coming to consult me." Dr. Mortimer seemed to be growing frustrated. "I have come to ask you what I am to do, Mr. Holmes. I have the last heir to the Baskerville line on a train headed this way, and I need to know if it is even safe to take him to his home or if I should keep him here in London." I took a deep breath to clear my confusion and interjected to dispel Mortimer's growing agitation. "Dr. Mortimer, I do believe you may have forgotten to give us vital information. I assume you are drawing a line between Mr. Baskerville's death and this story, but I can't see the connection." Dr. Mortimer looked at me for a moment, then his face flushed heavily. "Ah! Oh, dear me! I do believe I have forgotten. Forgive me, Mr. Holmes. You see, it was I who made the coroner's report. Charles Baskerville did indeed die from his heart giving out, but—" He trailed off momentarily. "On the ground, at the gate, there was a print of a hound." Holmes seemed to perk up at this bit of information. "Dr. Mortimer, I do believe it is vital that you tell me all of what you know of that night's events if you want to get your problem out of the murky waters into which it has sunk." Dr. Mortimer nodded. "You see, Mr. Holmes, that night Charles had gone out into the yew alley to smoke." Holmes tinted his fingers. "I take that this must have been unusual behavior for the man. Was the night a good one?" Mortimer shook his head. "Yes and no, Mr. Holmes. The household was only himself, his butler and cook, and a single servant girl. He saw no need to keep any other servants, and he had no guests. If the man wanted to smoke, he generally did so in his own study, not outside. He stayed out for such a long time, and tapped his pipe on the stone wall no less than 3 times. Holmes raised a brow. "Ah, Watson, here is a man after our own heart. 3 times on the wall, you say?" Mortimer smiled, a bit of pride showing on his face at the praise, and nodded. "Yes, you see, the yew alley is in the pathway that runs from the kitchen door down to the back gate. It's an alley by the way of the yew trees that line it, but there is also a small stone fence that lines the path, about 3 feet high." He tapped his pipe once walking down the path and twice walking back up. I frowned. "How on earth do you know that?" Mortimer looked at me in surprise and seemed about to answer, but Holmes spoke first. "Because the man was right-handed, Watson. Forgive her interruption, Doctor. Her head is still full of all the new techniques she's had to learn at Ypres." Mortimer nodded. "Yes, he was right-handed, and a slow walker. He must have lit his pipe halfway down the alley, then paced back and forth before his panic." Holmes' facial muscles twitched. "His panic?" Mortimer nodded again, and I wondered if his neck would wear out. "Yes, you see, when he came up to the gate, he dropped his pipe and ran in sheer terror, screaming all the way up to the kitchen door where his housekeeper met him. Unfortunately, whatever it was that scared him was too much for his heart, for he died at the step." Mortimer paused and clasped his hands. "Mr. Holmes, I didn't say anything in my report or at the inquest, as there are a few people who would believe in the hound to this day. There, at the gate, just a bit behind it, was the footprint of a massive hound, and I need to know if the curse of the Baskervilles has come back to haunt them. Also, if I will be abetting in this young man's demise if I take him to his ancestral home." Dr. Mortimer's concern was as sincere as anyone's could be. He looked at Holmes imploringly, hoping for an answer. Holmes looked unimpressed, but not upset. "I am afraid, Dr. Mortimer, if the Baskerville family is indeed cursed, then that is a spiritual matter, and there is nothing I can do for you. However," Mortimer's face began to fall until Holmes continued to speak. "If the matter is physical, as I suspect, then I very well may be able to give you an answer. Although first you must give some to me." Mortimer stepped forward. "I'll tell you anything, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled. "Very good. Now do you know if Charles Baskerville had any enemies?" The doctor shook his head. "I can't imagine anyone having a grudge against him. He made his fortune in South Africa and returned to invest into the community. Almost everyone has received some sort of funding from him, and his kindness is known throughout the village." Holmes frowned. "Is there anyone who would benefit from his death? His servants, perhaps?" Mortimer blinked, then nodded. "That would make just about anyone a suspect, Mr. Holmes, including myself. His servants, Mr. and Mrs. Barrymore, are without fault. The Barrymore family have served the Baskervilles for generations, and they had a great love for Sir Charles. He left them a hefty sum, around £1,000, I believe. He left me the same as his executor, then bits here and there to various families." Holmes' intrigue seemed to grow. "I see. And who were Sir Charles' closest neighbors?" Mortimer thought for a moment. "That would be myself, Mr. Franklin, and Mr. and Miss Stapleton. The Stapletons were very fond of Sir Charles, and he found great amusement in them in turn. He especially liked to hear about all of Mr. Stapleton's collections. And his sister is a charming woman, while Mr. Franklin—" He paused for a moment, clearly thinking over his words. "Is a man who takes his honor very seriously, but he too liked Sir Charles. They got on quite well, considering that Mr. Franklin cares for few people. He lives in Laughter Hall, and the Stapletons in Merripit House. Now, Mr. Holmes, it is a quarter of an hour until Henry Baskerville's train arrives, and I really do need to know what I am to do." He looked at Holmes pleadingly, while Holmes gazed at him languidly. "What you will do, Dr. Mortimer, is you will retrieve Sir Henry from his train and take him to a hotel. You will then bring him here tomorrow morning. If this is a matter of a curse, then the devil is as apt to get him here in London as he is on the moors. If it is not, then I will need time to think this problem over." Dr. Mortimer nodded, relief washing over his features as the responsibility of decision was lifted from his shoulders. "Yes, of course, I do need to go." He glanced at the clock which hung over the fireplace, then retrieved his dog's leash. "I will see you in the morning, then. Good evening, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson." Just as the man was retreating, Holmes spoke. "Dr. Mortimer, your cane." Mortimer spun around, thoroughly embarrassed, and grabbed it. "Ah, thank you." After the good doctor had left, Holmes sprung from his seat, excitement tensing in every muscle. "Well, Watson, what do you make of this?" I, who had been glancing over my notes, looked to him. "I think someone clearly frightened the poor old man to death, though whether it was for money or some kind of revenge or even an accident is hard to say." Holmes smiled. "And the curse?" I shook my head. "You know well that I am a Protestant, Holmes. While I do believe that curses can exist, I'm far more inclined to believe that Hugo Baskerville managed to irritate a large English wolf in his mad dashing through the night. They weren't extinct yet at the time." Holmes' face tensed with excitement. "And why do you think this wolf did not go after the girl as well?" I shrugged. "How should I know? Perhaps it was only Baskerville that irritated it. Perhaps it was Providence. Either way, I highly doubt that it matters. Besides, a curse being laid upon the family makes little sense when the woman to whom it would have avenged married into that very family." Holmes clapped his hands together. "There's my logical Watson. Now, I did notice that you seemed to perk up when Dr. Mortimer mentioned the name Henry Baskerville. Do you know him?" I shook my head. "Not exactly. I knew a man by a similar name when I did my residency in Canada. He was a friend, but his name was French. Baskervilles. At least, I think it was." Holmes raised a brow. "How amusing it would be for him to be the same person." Holmes made himself comfortable in his chair. "Now, Watson, would you be so kind as to make yourself scarce? I need to think, and I do believe any presence would be unacceptably distracting." I had grown used to these requests and nodded, taking my book up, but he stopped me. "Do leave your notes. I believe they will be of use to me." I glanced down at the book. "But therein—" Holmes made a shooing motion with his hand. Your cipher. Yes, I know. I worked it out a few weeks ago. Now run along. Part of me wanted to be annoyed that he had already worked out my cipher, but it had only taken me and Nanny a few days to plot out and memorize the thing, so it seemed useless to be annoyed that a greater mind than ours deciphered it so quickly. I left him and went to my room, where I found a package with a letter. Opening the letter, I was surprised to find it was from Nanny. She had sent the package to assure that I could amuse myself, and thoroughly scolded me for not writing. A pang of guilt went through me, and I resolved to write her back then and there. I opened the package and found my embroidery kit and several packages of herbs and teas, likely sent at her father's insistence. He was a very good man. She likewise had sent me only the best silk thread, even though she knew that I only ever purchased cotton. It was late in the evening by the time that I had finished writing and giving my letters to the servant who was going out to post the Mr. Holmes's mail. After writing Nanny, I decided to write to her father as well, and of course my uncle and mother. Nanny's father was highly respected in my town back home, running the best restaurant. He had worked with the railroad and came to live in our little town in the late 70s. He was the reason my family knew that bread made me sick, and very likely the reason that my little sister was alive at all. He had been a doctor in his home country and made sure that all the people in his new one were healthy and happy. He was also the reason that I decided to pursue medicine. After I had finished, my hand was thoroughly worn out, and I realized that I could likely check in with Holmes. So, rubbing my sore hand, I made my way to that room, where I knocked upon the door. "You may come in, Watson, but you will want to open a window." I was momentarily confused by this response, but as I opened the door, a great gust of pipe smoke came out of the room. Not wanting to fill the hallway with the stuff, I swiftly closed the door and made my way to the window, opening the thing and allowing the atmosphere to clear. I steadied my nerves, which were alarmed by the smoke, and made my way to scold the man, but he spoke first. "There's no need to scold me, Watson. I did not realize that I had put the room in such a state. You see, I have not been present." Once more the man confused me, but then I looked down upon the table and realized that there was a map spread before him. "You've been on the moors?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, and I'm afraid to say that, while I've been gone, my body has consumed several ounces of tobacco and a whole pot of coffee." The table did indeed have a coffee pot and mug next to the map. I took a moment to wish that my host had not had so much foresight as to order quite so many dry goods before the start of the war. In the basement there were barrels of the stuff vital to comfortable living. Tea, coffee, tobacco, and even fabrics aplenty. Had my friend been restricted to the official rations, he would not have had the opportunity to be so frivolous. I crossed my arms in concern. "I see. And have you found anything of note?" Holmes glanced at my arms and smirked. "I know the location of Merripit House and Laughter Hall. I also know where there exist prehistoric huts and of the Grimpen Mire. Also, the nearest train station is in the nearby village of Coombe Tracy." I shook my head. "And how is any of this useful?" Disappointment crossed Holmes' face. "My dear Watson, this information is vital to solving the mystery. I can see the smoke has agitated you. Why don't we have some dinner, and then you can retire to your rooms?" I wanted to be annoyed, but he was right. Even with the window wide open, the smoke was so thick that my nerves were aflame. Thus together we went down to dinner, and I made my escape back to my rooms, where I decided that I would put to good use some of the silks Nanny had sent me. I had attempted to sleep, but that night was one of those nights where terror seized my mind, and all dreams were only the worst memories. So I continued upon the task I had set out to do. I hadn't a plan when I began embroidering, but I found myself stitching a violin and pipe. When these were complete, I chuckled. This family certainly had wedged their way into my mind. I thought for a moment, then remembered how delighted and grateful Mary had been for the booties I had made her soon-to-be child. I began then to stitch a rather small, intricate piece. I thought that perhaps she might like a small depiction of mother and child to hang in the latter's room. This took me well into the early hours of the morning, but it wasn't a huge piece, so I did manage to finish it that same night. Just as I was clipping the last thread, a knock on the door startled me. "Ah, come in." One of the maids entered. Mr. Holmes is asking that you join him in the study, Doctor. I nodded. I'll be there momentarily. Would you mind bringing coffee to the room? She nodded and slipped out the door. Coming to the realization that I had indeed worked through the night and that we would be meeting with Dr. Mortimer later, I freshened myself up. My fingertips were a bit red, as they always were if I worked on a piece for too long, but there was nothing that could be done for that. I put away my work, satisfying myself that I would give it to Mary later, and changed into a new blouse before heading to the study. Holmes was sitting in the same position he had been in most of the day prior, leading me to believe that he had come back to this room and sat there all night. "Did you enjoy your sewing, Watson?" I blinked. Holmes stood and grasped my hand, inspecting my fingertips. "Embroidering by the looks of your fingertips." I pulled my hand away. "You need to stop touching me like that." He raised a brow. "Does it bother you?" I sighed. "Yes, I don't like to be touched without warning. It's fine if it's to prevent a fall or injury, or is intentional and routine like when dancing, or support while walking long distances, but otherwise it's irritating." Holmes nodded. "Very well. I take you did not sleep at all last night." I shook my head. "I tried, but it was not worthwhile." Holmes frowned, then gestured for me to sit when the maid came in with coffee. The blessed girl poured me a cup of the stuff and set an oat cake before me. I had mentioned all of one time that drinking coffee before I had had anything to eat hurt my stomach, and she had always ensured to provide food with my coffee from that moment forward. I suppose that it really should come as no surprise that a household as old and respectable as that of the Holmes family should hire a competent staff. I blew gently across the surface of my coffee and looked at Holmes. "So have you solved the mystery?" Holmes raised a brow at me. "Watson, surely you've assisted me enough by now to know that I don't yet have enough information to draw a conclusion." I smiled in amusement. "Have I?" Holmes laughed. "Don't try to be soulful, Watson. It doesn't suit you." I laughed in turn. "Well, what does suit me, then?" Holmes thought for a moment. "Well, you're quite homely, so practicality and common sense seem to be your friend." I blinked as a wave of indignation came over me. Certainly, I was hardly a pretty girl, but most people have the decency not to say so to my face. Though as soon as it came, it left, leaving me feel rather empty. After all, what use is there in being angry? It only leaves you tired and alone. "I had thought I had very little sense from the way you seem to act. You are always seeing things that most either don't or can't." Holmes gave me a glare and shook his head. "Watson, I wish that my capabilities fell under the realm of common sense. Unfortunately, it seems that most men of this age are rather incompetent, leaving those with common sense to make terrible messes of mystery and murder. You, though, have the capacity to use your common sense properly, and even see past it when prompted, which is more than I can say about most of Scotland Yard." The rest of breakfast went by fairly quickly. Holmes seemed to be in a positive, if thoughtful mood, and I was a bit downcast by his statement. Holmes was always bluntly honest, and it seemed that the truth could hurt. I knew that I was no beauty, and certainly Poshadale had taken what little charm I had held. I mentally shook my head. I had my mind, and that was enough. It would have to be. I wanted to pray, as I always did when my emotions were particularly high, but we were waiting for Dr. Mortimer and this Baskerville fellow, and I would not pray in front of others. Those words were mine, and mine alone. I was spared from my thoughts when the maid came in to collect our dishes and announced Dr. Mortimer's arrival. Holmes and I stood to greet our guests as Mortimer and a familiar face walked in. I panicked for a moment as I found myself swept up into the arms of a very happy, if worn-looking infantryman. The scent of his jacket hit me, and I suddenly understood who this stranger was. "Henry?" I had just managed to squeak out the one word as his lean arms crushed me into a hug. Henry's arms seemed to grip even tighter as he spoke. "Johanna, it really is you. When Mortimer told me that you were here in London, I didn't want to believe him. Did you really go to Ypres? If only I had been stationed there, but I was in Italy." Holmes cleared his throat. "Mr. Baskerville, if you would be so kind as to put down my colleague, we would like to discuss your situation." Henry looked at Holmes, then slowly lowered my feet to the floor, keeping a firm grip on my arms. Of course. Here, Joe, let me get a good long look at you. It's good to see a friendly face. Do you know where Malinois has been sent? I shook my head at the mention of our mutual friend. I haven't the foggiest. I hadn't seen him in ages by the time that I left the States. What about you? I thought your farm was declared vital to industry. Henry grinned. I sold the farm. I wanted to enlist, and the man I sold it to wanted to expand his operations, so it was an ideal situation. I laughed. And look at you now, a rich man. Henry's eyes took on a sly look. I don't suppose you'll marry me now, will you? I shook my head with a laugh. Not till you become my unicorn. Holmes put a hand on my shoulder and seemed to glare at Henry. If you two are done with your little inside jokes, could we please discuss the matter at hand? His voice was irritated, and a pang of guilt ran through me. I had been so excited to see Henry that I had become thoroughly distracted. Henry blinked, but took Holmes' irritation in stride, letting go of my arms. Yes, of course, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Mortimer has filled me in on what has happened to my uncle, and I'm afraid we have more to tell you. Something rather strange has happened. Holmes seemed to calm down after Henry acknowledged him. Well then, Mr. Baskerville, I suppose you should sit down and tell me everything. Henry sat on the couch and gently patted the spot beside him while I picked up my journal, which I had dropped when he hugged me. I bit down a laugh and sat beside him while Mortimer sat in the chair next to the couch. I linked my arm through Henry's as he launched into his story. It began after Mortimer met me at the train yesterday. I started to get the feeling that we were being followed. At first I just shrugged it off. I did just get back from Italy, so I thought I might be paranoid. We started shopping, buying warmer clothes for the winter and whatnot. During this, I bought 2 new pairs of boots, which, when we arrived at the hotel, I set out to be polished. I like a nice shine. At any rate, this morning the hotel told me that they couldn't find one of them. Their shoe cleaner insisted that he had set the shoes by the door when he finished, but a single boot was missing. You can understand how that would upset a man, and I told them to just find the boot. Now, while I was dealing with this situation at the front desk, the porter said a letter had come for me. I took the letter and opened it, and well, here it is. He took a piece of paper out of his pocket and handed it to Holmes, who had irritation on his face again. It was a note with all the words cut out of a magazine, except for one. It read as follows: If you value your life or reason, stay away from the moor. Holmes raised a brow, the irritation fading. Now this is interesting. I do believe, Dr. Mortimer, that we can rule out a curse. This paper is quite physical. It is doubtful that a devil would go to such lengths. Dr. Mortimer looked worried still. Be that as it may, Mr. Holmes, it does confirm that Sir Henry is in danger. Perhaps it would be best for him not to go to the moor after all. Henry stood swiftly, his voice rising as he spoke, and dragged me up with him accidentally. Not go to the moor! I won't stand for that, Mortimer. If some man is trying to run me out of my own home, I'll stand and face him like a man. I will have none of this! His outburst caused me to flinch, which caught his eye, and his demeanor softened. He placed a hand on my arm. Sorry, Joe. I still sometimes forget. I gave him a smile. He always did try. Mortimer shook his head at Henry's outburst. Well, if that's the case, Sir Henry, then I ask, Mr. Holmes, what are we to do? Holmes, who had been listening to all this intently, perked up. Why, you are to trust me explicitly. This is certainly a case of the physical, and I can and will get it sorted for you. Henry nodded. I'm very grateful for that, Mr. Holmes. I'll pay you whatever you like. Holmes waved off his comment and continued. In the meantime, I do believe it wouldn't do for you to be alone. If you ever are, it is very likely that whoever wants you away from the moor shall make an attempt on your life. Is there anyone that you could trust to stay with you? Henry glanced at Dr. Mortimer. I can't exactly keep Mortimer away from his practice. Could you come with me to Devon? Holmes shook his head. I'm afraid I'm rather busy at the moment, and can't be spared to leave London. He stopped speaking for a moment, looking almost pensive as an idea seemed to cross his face. But Henry spoke before him. We had sat back down, and his other hand came around and grabbed my arm. What about Joe? Holmes blinked. Dr. Watson, she's hardly in any state to. Holmes got a bit of a taste of his own medicine here, because Henry cut him off. Trench ragged or not, she's the best shot I've ever seen. She could shoot the smirk off a Frenchman. I'll be as safe with her as with any man. Holmes and Mortimer looked concerned, but I started laughing. Henry always did have a way with words that evoked that reaction from me.
"I'd be happy to accompany you to your estate, Henry, but I'm in terrible condition. I'm nowhere near the state of health I was in when we went hunting."
"It'll be fine. Besides, you're working with Mr. Holmes now, aren't you? This way you can report back to him. I'm certain that anything you send to him would be far more detailed than what I could." I glanced to Holmes for approval of this plan. "I suppose that will do, Sir Henry. You and Watson are quite familiar, and I certainly can depend upon her for detailed reports." Dr. Mortimer looked less convinced than Holmes, but assented none the less. "We'll have to leave for Devon this evening. Can you be ready by then?" I nodded. Henry gave me one final hug, and we promised to catch up on the train. Not a minute after they had left, Holmes urged me into my coat and out the door. I was greatly confused, but realized that we were tailing the two men. "Holmes, why?" Holmes firmly linked his arm through mine. "Because, Watson, it is a lovely day for a stroll." He discreetly gestured toward a carriage that was making its way in the direction of the men, and his reasons were made clear to me. We followed for a few minutes before the carriage pulled up alongside Dr. Mortimer and my old friend, whereupon the window opened, and out came what looked like a walking stick of some kind. Holmes sprung forward, ready to push Sir Henry out of the way, but it was unnecessary. Henry, the soldier that he was, had caught a glance down the barrel of the gun, and leapt out of the way, pulling Dr. Mortimer with him. The shot was strangely quiet, except for the crash of the window glass it had broken. We hurried forward to check on the men. Holmes grabbed an arm of each man and pulled them to their feet. "Are you all right?" Henry, who had an overexcited look that boded no good, nodded. "Well, I'll be, Mr. Holmes. Someone does want to kill me. This is going to be a roaring good time." Holmes escorted the men back to their hotel while I returned to gather my things. I arranged to have them sent to the station and went to the hotel, where I found things in a state of chaos. Henry was speaking with a maid who was rather upset over being spoken to at the volume which Henry was using. I walked up to Henry intending to intervene, but upon seeing me he lowered his voice. "Just see to it that it's found." He gestured for her to go. "Joe, you'll never guess what has happened." I put a hand on my hip, leaning heavily on my cane with the other. "Well, then, I suppose you had better tell me." Henry gave a pout, his gaunt face looking rather scary as he did so. "Aw, where's the fun in that, eh?" I rolled my eyes. "There's none at all if the way you were speaking to that maid was any indication." Henry swung his arm around me, and I instinctively leaned on his shoulder briefly. "Ah, there's my Joe. My boot has returned." I straightened and gave him a bemused smile. "And that's a bad thing?" He had led me into his rooms, where Holmes and Dr. Mortimer were on their hands and knees looking under the furniture. "Only because now my old boots have gone missing." I glanced down at his feet, where his boots were in the same position they were earlier that morning. No, not those, my issued boots. I was going to save them as a souvenir since I left whatever was usable with my squad, but now they're gone." I frowned in consternation. Why in the world would someone steal worthless old boots? Holmes rose to his feet and gave me a look that I couldn't parse. "That is what I would like to know." He had looked strange and gangly on the floor, and now he seemed to be even taller than he was before. I noted in surprise that he was indeed taller than Henry, which I would not have expected. "Sir Henry, it does seem to be that you have someone wanting you dead. Are you certain that you wish to continue on to your estate after all of this?" Henry nodded. "I wasn't afraid to risk my life for Mother England, and I'm not about to cower before a single man when I face the horrors of fighting the Austrians." Holmes smiled brightly. "Good man! We'll get this sorted out soon enough." We never did find those boots. I spent the rest of the day with Henry and Dr. Mortimer. Holmes, before leaving, took me aside. "I'm not entirely comfortable with this, Watson. I have the feeling that I'm sending you into a most deadly situation." I gave him my most reassuring smile. "It won't be my first, Holmes. I'll be certain to write daily." "Are you sure you can't come out yourself?" Holmes shook his head gravely. "No, I cannot. Now, Watson, it is of the utmost importance that you never leave Sir Henry's side. It will be much safer for the both of you that way." I assured him that I would stay with Henry, and he made his way off. The trip to Devonshire was eventful, Henry and I catching each other up on what had been happening in each other's lives, while Dr. Mortimer injected periodically with bits of information. "It seems you didn't fare so well on the front yourself." I nodded. "Shrapnel just about everywhere. I would say it's a miracle that I'm not dead or immobile. The attack caught us off guard, and I was the lucky one." Henry nodded, tapping a spot on his leg with 2 fingers. "I had a bayonet clip my thigh. If it weren't for the skill of the medics and the fact that my major blood vessels were missed, I would be dead. Mortimer found me in a hospital, and here we are." His gaze went pensive. "I was being serious, you know. I don't suppose—" He trailed off, and I shook my head, a habit as of late. "I'm afraid my sensitivity has increased since returning from the front. If I ever marry, it would have to be to a rather meek man." I laughed while attempting the joke. Henry wasn't wrong in asking. We had always been good friends, and marriage had been considered. But he was a man with a rather hot temper, and having grown up with such a man, I had no interest in spending the rest of my life with one. Henry grinned a grin that I knew meant mischief. "Ah, so like Mortimer." Mortimer's face flushed at the suggestion, and I laughed, but came to the poor doctor's defense. "Leave poor Mortimer out of this. Your sense of humor will be too much for him." Dr. Mortimer rode with us to the manor to give proper introductions to the staff. As I looked out through the fading light across the moors, I couldn't help but smile. They look how I feel on the inside. I had not expected Henry to really hear, but he did. "Yes, not quite empty, yet like there's something missing, some spark of life." Dr. Mortimer once more gave us a look that seemed cross with pity and something that I couldn't quite place. "You two seem very close." I nodded. "Henry and I were mates while I was doing my residency." Henry's arm wrapped around my shoulders, and he smiled. "Yep, I went to the hospital with a major gash in my leg, and Jojo stitched me back up. We've been fast friends ever since." Mortimer nodded, a hint of amusement crossing his face as he heard the nickname. "Ah, here we are." Part 14. The manor was a dark and imposing old place, though clearly renovated in some places. Henry assisted me down as a man walked out to us. He was rather short and thin, with a black beard and somber expression. "Ah, that's Barrymore." Mortimer introduced us to the man who served the household, as well as his wife, who seemed to be Barrymore's opposite, tall and plump, with her fair hair tied in a bun at the base of her skull. She also seemed very kind. They appeared surprised to see me, but after we explained the situation to them, they relaxed. We had decided along the way to tell them only that I was an old friend of Henry's, here to keep him company as he settled in. They seemed more than content with this explanation and led us to the prepared rooms so we could freshen up before dinner. Barrymore sat us in the dining hall, a great old cavernous place lined with the portraits of Henry's ancestors. Henry smiled at the men as he placed our dinner before us. "Thank you, Barrymore." Barrymore nodded, then turned to go, but paused. "Sir, I believe I should tell you it is our intent to leave as soon as you can find suitable replacements." Henry looked up, surprised. "Why, but I thought you have served my family for generations." Barrymore nodded. "Be that as it may, sir, we were really quite fond of Sir Charles, and his death was quite shocking considering the circumstances." He trailed off, and Henry and I simultaneously remembered that it was Mrs. Barrymore who found the body. "Ah, well, I'm sorry to see you go, but I'll try to arrange something as soon as I can." Barrymore bowed. "Thank you, sir." Henry let out a long and tired sigh. "Joe, I don't know what to think. I'll find out I'm rich, then get to England, only to find out that someone wants me dead. I'm hoppin' mad, but also just tired." I placed my hand on his arm sympathetically. "I'm in a similar strange boat myself, Henry. I don't think anything has seemed normal since I returned, and I'm not certain if it's the behavior of my hosts or if it's just me." We sat there in silence for a few minutes, reveling in the shared emotions. Henry stood suddenly, as if he had found some spark of life. "Well, at least we have each other now, and maybe I can find me a wife." I laughed. "Out here in the middle of nowhere, who would you marry, a farmer's daughter?" Henry scowled playfully. "You know well that I would prefer a farmer's daughter over most women. At least she'll have some understanding of how I operate." Henry and I retired to bed amid our mutual laughter, and likely, due to the lack of sleep I suffered the night prior, I slept heavily, if not entirely peacefully. The next morning Dr. Mortimer called on Sir Henry and set him upon a large amount of paperwork that needed completion. After ensuring that Henry would go nowhere without my accompaniment, I set off for the nearest post office. It would be a rather long walk, but I was unperturbed. As I made my way along the road, I made note of the houses along it. At one point I passed a grove of trees and scrub which I thought would make quite a good place of cover on this mostly open landscape. I shook my head and sighed at the thought. I may have been on the battlefield only as a medic, but you learned far more than you ever wanted to know simply by nature of being there. It took a good while to get to town, and once I arrived I went straight to the office to post my letters. I was surprised to find that Holmes had already sent one to me. I decided that I would read it upon my return to the hall, in case of any sensitive information. Seeing that the office was in the same building as a hotel with a bar, and being weary from my sojourn, I made my way for something to drink. The barkeep blessedly had cider, which I ordered a pint of and sat to rest. I am not much of a drinker, but a small amount of alcohol will soothe aching muscles. Not long after I had sat down, a policeman came into the bar. He looked vaguely familiar, and I tried to remember where I had seen him before, when he, seeming to recognize me, came over. "Dr. Watson, what are you doing out here?" His voice prompted my mind, and I realized it was Detective Lestrade, whereupon I began to share in his surprise. "I'm visiting with an old friend, Inspector. What are you doing here?" Inspector Lestrade sat down next to me. "There's a murderer loose on the moors. Have you heard the name Selden?" I frowned. "The Notting Hill murderer?" Lestrade nodded. "That's the one. He managed to escape, and he's out here on the moors. I've been put in charge of capturing him. Holmes isn't out here, is he?" I shook my head. "No, I'm alone. The new tenant of Baskerville Hall is an old friend of mine. When he found out I was in London, he asked me to come with him until he gets settled." A look of relief crossed Lestrade's features, which was then replaced with concern. "You walked all the way here from Baskerville Hall by yourself?" I smiled. "I wanted to. I need the exercise, or else I'll never grow strong again, and I would like to be able to perform surgeries again. I do so love to have my hands deep inside a man." I finished my statement rather coyly. This gruesome joke did little to assuage Lestrade's concerns, and he grimaced. "Be that as it may, there is a murderer on the loose. Let me walk you back to the hall. At least, we need all feet on the ground anyway, so I'll be killing 2 birds with 1 stone. And so Lestrade accompanied me on my way back to the hall. I didn't mind all that much. Lestrade was a decent conversationalist, and it was nice to have something to occupy my mind. As we drew nearer the hall, we heard a strange voice shouting, "Mr. Holmes! Dr. Watson!" We turned toward the voice, and were surprised to see a young blonde, who appeared to be in his 20s, hurrying towards us. He had a large butterfly net and a collection box that bounced against him comically as he moved. We stopped, and he made his way up to us breathlessly. "Ah, Dr. Watson, thank you, and to you as well, Mr. Holmes. It took me a minute to catch up to you." I glanced at Lestrade in amusement. "I am indeed Dr. Watson, but this isn't Mr. Holmes. This is Detective Inspector Lestrade. May I ask your name?" The young man looked surprised for a moment. "Forgive me, Inspector. I'm Stapleton, Mr. Jack Stapleton. Dr. Mortimer gave me your description, and I wanted to speak with you about your time in Belgium. I'm a naturalist, you see, and I wanted to find out how the weapons of war are affecting the presence of wildlife." I frowned. "It seems everyone wants to speak to me about my time at Ypres. But first, may I ask why you assumed that this was Mr. Holmes?" I gestured to Lestrade, who seemed to be sizing up the man. Stapleton smiled casually. I assumed that he had come to investigate Sir Charles' death. Concerned, I gave him a look. I was under the impression that Sir Charles died of a heart attack. Stapleton nodded sagely. Yes, that's what killed him. But the convict has likely been upon the moor for some time. He escaped ages ago and only recently showed up on the moor. But what if he was here longer? Don't you think that he could have scared Sir Charles to death, Inspector? I assume that's why you're here. Inspector Lestrade looked thoughtful. I suppose, he proceeded slowly, that the presence of a man with a weapon could indeed terrify an older gentleman to the point of death. What do you think, Doctor? Both men looked at me expectantly, and I shook my head. I'm a doctor, gentlemen. I only deal in facts, as I can't afford to do otherwise. I don't know what caused Sir Charles' heart attack, only that he had one. Lestrade nodded. That's fair, Doctor. Stapleton's mood seemed to change for a moment, but I couldn't quite parse what had caused it. Well, if you're not here to inquire into Sir Charles' death, do you mind me asking what you're doing here at all? I smiled. Sir Henry is an old friend of mine. I did my residency in Canada, and we met when he came in after a ploughing accident. Stapleton looked surprised. Ah, that explains it then. Well, you must tell him to come to tea, both of you. You as well, Inspector. Surely you can take one night off for a hot meal. Lestrade smiled. That sounds lovely. I'm sure we would love to take you up on your offer. I scrutinized Stapleton as Lestrade spoke. His fair hair was quite curly, his eyes blue and piercing. He seemed perfectly healthy, and I couldn't help but wonder what kept him off the front lines. Just then we heard the strangest of sounds, like a deep, melancholic howl. Lestrade stiffened. What was that? His strange enunciation made it clear that he had only kept his language clean for my sake. Stapleton smiled. The howl of the Hound of the Baskervilles, a great devil, or so the locals would have you believe. Every single person who has had to traverse these roads at night has seen it at one point or another. I listened for a moment longer. There was something familiar about the sound that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I glanced at Stapleton as it faded away. And you believe in it? He gave a laugh. Hardly! I'm a naturalist. I've crossed the moors dozens of times. They often make strange sounds. Why, just last week I saw a pony sink into the mire, and the sound it let out would just make your blood curdle. You wouldn't think a pony could let out such a sound, but then even rabbits scream when they are in danger. I shook my head sadly. I suppose there are many animals lost in the mire, then? He nodded sagely. Thousands, I would say. It wouldn't surprise me if that convict of yours stayed missing, Inspector. Even the most able-bodied man can be pulled in. I'm one of the few people in the world who can cross safely, and even that's only due to careful inspection and practice. Inspector Lestrade nodded grimly. I've seen the mire. It would be due justice for Selden to meet his end in such a manner. Stapleton looked like he was about to agree, but instead swiftly excused himself and darted off, waving his net about his head. Lestrade and I looked at each other and laughed. The man was certainly entertaining, if nothing else, but that was not to be our only encounter with a Stapleton. We had continued along and were passing by the gate of the Merripit house when a young woman came up to us. "Oh, Sir Henry, you must leave the moor." Bewildered, I glanced at Lestrade, who shook his head at the woman. I'm not Sir Henry, miss. The woman, tall and dark, with the slightest hint of an accent, suddenly blushed. Ah, forgive me. I'm just so worried about the curse, you see. These words were spat out hurriedly and came off very strange. I'm Detective Inspector Lestrade, and this is Dr. Watson. She's an old friend of Sir Henry's, and I was just seeing her back to the hall. I'm sure she will pass on your concerns to Sir Henry. The woman looked hesitant, then nodded. Please do. The Hound is such a concern for me. She hurried off, and Lestrade and I continued on our way. Damned gypsies don't know what's good for them. I glanced up at Lestrade in surprise. How do you know she's a gypsy? Lestrade gave an annoyed glance in the direction the woman had gone. No? Just look at her. With that complexion, there's no way for her to be anything else, especially with that talk about the Hound. They believe deeply in curses, and they are not to be cured of it. Unfortunate, as they are quite a friendly people." I was less than convinced of Lestrade's theory, but said nothing to refute it. We arrived at the hall to find Sir Henry in the same spot I had left him, puzzling over his papers. I introduced the two men, and Henry invited the inspector to tea. We had something of a merry time. Henry's and my old comradeship had renewed, and Lestrade was a tolerable companion when Holmes wasn't there to constantly needle him. We played cards until late in the evening, when Lestrade made his way to his hotel. I said good night to Henry, then retired to my room. Mrs. Barrymore had brought me in a fresh pitcher of water, as the old place had yet to be installed with taps in every washroom. It was fortunate that Sir Charles had installed a modern toilet, which both Henry and I were ecstatic about. After our time spent in the trenches of Europe, neither of us were keen on the idea of chamber pots. When I was undressing, I remembered the letter from Holmes and took it out of my pocket, stepping over to the desk to read it. "Dearest Watson, I had thought that I would let you report first, but I discovered information that you will find key to keeping Sir Henry safe. I traced the cabby that drove the gunman. The plate number made that easy enough. The driver was insulted at first, but after finding out that it was not his driving abilities that were in question, he was quite agreeable. Apparently, he never got a good look at his fare's face, but could say that he seemed to be of average height with a very dark beard. The fare paid him double to drive round the block, then follow Sir Henry and Dr. Mortimer, eventually pulling up alongside the two of them so that he could make his shot. He then told the cabby to pull away swiftly, and got some miles away. He even told the cabby his name, Sherlock Holmes. Apparently his exact words were, "If anyone comes asking after me, you should let them know that my name is Detective Sherlock Holmes. I tell you, Watson, this man that we are dealing with, and it is a man, there are no spirits at work here, is nothing short of a criminal genius. Make absolutely certain that Sir Henry never goes out alone. Always have your revolver with you, and keep an eye on the butler. I remember well that Mortimer mentioned his dark beard. Sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes." I wasn't entirely certain what to make of this new information, except that I should definitely inform Henry first thing in the morning. The whole affair was beginning to give me a headache. I had no doubt that Henry and I both had faced far more terrifying situations, but to have these things happen at home was rather distressing. I glanced at the box which contained the teas that Nanny and her father had sent me, then rang for some hot water. Now was as good a time as any to restore a bit of vitality and health. Later on that night I awoke. The tea had always helped me to sleep, being some blend of herbs that Lao Shen had said would do so, among other things. The only problem was that the effect was very short-lived, and I would often awake in the middle of the night. This, however, was still better than attempting to sleep without it, and I turned over, attempting to settle back down to sleep, when I heard a sound like a woman crying. I stood and put on a robe. Grabbing my revolver, I stepped out into the dark hall. I was met by Henry, who had a candle. "Did you hear that?" I nodded. "You don't think it was just that young girl having a case of homesickness, do you?" Hesitantly, I furrowed my brow. "It's possible, but let's check just in case." We slowly made our way down the hall, only to be met by Barrymore, fully dressed despite the late hour. "Barrymore, what are you doing up?" Henry had brought his voice from a whisper to a normal tone, as Barrymore was a bit deaf. Barrymore, unperturbed at the sight of a bedraggled soldier and woman staring him down in a dark hall, replied smoothly, "I always get up to check the furnace around this hour, sir. It is rather old and inefficient." I frowned. "Did you hear that crying sound?" My question did seem to disturb Barrymore, if only momentarily. "I heard nothing of the sort, but I am made to understand by my wife that the young maid we have hired does cry on occasion. If that is all, may I return to my bed?" Henry nodded and let the man go while we continued on in the direction Barrymore had come from. Something doesn't make sense here. I gestured exasperatedly. What? The fact that he was claiming to check the furnace while coming down from a dead end, or the fact that the servant girl's room is near the kitchen, and we shouldn't have heard anything at all? There was an exhausted sarcasm in my voice as we inspected the window. Wanting to give Barrymore the benefit of the doubt, we had looked for any kind of stairs or hatchway that could lead to the furnace, but there was nothing. Henry shook his head. I suppose it is possible that he was checking the windows. There are a lot of them, and he may have forgotten to check this one before going to bed. It's possible that the task is so routine it didn't even occur to him to mention it. I sighed and shook my head. That's what we're going to have to assume until we can find out more information. It's a little strange for him to be up and about so late, but we don't know what his habits were with your uncle. Henry looked hesitant, but agreed. I suppose we should go back to bed, but is that Nanny's tea I smell on you? I nodded. You want some? We could make our way down to the kitchen. Henry assented, and we did just that, after retrieving the tea from my room. Nanny had followed me during my residency, that being part of her agreement with my uncle, and Henry had been quite fond of her cooking and tea. Once in the kitchen, I started the kettle and set myself in one of the 2 chairs that were there. What are your plans for tomorrow? Henry sighed and laid his face in his hands. More paperwork. I don't think I can handle it, Joe. I laughed. Well, it's your own fault for joining the military instead of staying on your farm where you belonged. Frankly, I'm surprised they even let you join with all of those old scars. Henry flushed. Well, they didn't prevent me from serving properly. I gave Henry an apologetic smile. Oh, don't be upset, Henry. I'm just teasing. I'm sure if you had stayed on the farm, Mortimer would have had an easier time finding you. Henry's muscles relaxed, and he shook his head, smiling. I'm not upset. Frankly, I'm just rather glad that you can tease me at all. You didn't used to. Something's changed about you, Joe. You're not as dead as before, which is strange, as most of us come back from the trenches in the same state that you went into them. I lowered my eyes. Yes, I suppose I can admit the truth in that, to you, at least, though it's certainly not the front that made the change. My hosts are such a lively family. It would be impossible not to liven up a bit myself, I think. Henry gave me a warm smile that told me he was pleased by my admission. I'm glad to hear that. I was frightened for you. The first time I saw you react to your father— Henry, don't. I did not like to cut people off, especially mid-word, but I was not up for discussing the subject he was about to bring up. Please. I stood as the kettle sung and poured the hot water into the teapot. I'm sorry, Joe. I know you don't like to talk about it, but it scared me to see you go so limp and lifeless. It scares me more now that I've seen that same look in men who have lost all hope. The muscles of my back stiffened, and I sighed. Henry, please. Henry went quiet, and I poured him his tea, taking a cup of the soothing brew for myself. We discussed nothing more that night, Henry's insistence having muted the mood. The next morning I was up early, the tea only having kept me asleep for a few hours. Still, it was a few solid hours free from nightmares, and I made a mental note to thank Nanny once again. I had breakfast with Henry, which was served by Mrs. Barrymore, who had red-rimmed eyes. When she left the room, I spoke. So, Barrymore lied to us. Henry, who was very soft at heart, frowned. Yes, but that proves nothing. If it is his wife who was upset, it is his right to withhold why, even if it is in my own house. I nodded. Things were murky and confusing. I think I'm going to go out and call upon some of your neighbors today. Holmes will want the information, and it'll do me some good to continue to get exercise. Henry nodded. I wish I could go with you, but I still have so much paperwork to slog through. Are you not sore, though, after yesterday? I shook my head with a smile. No, Nanny's tea does wonders for that. I do miss her and Lau. Henry nodded and smiled. So that's why I feel so much better today. How are they doing? I sipped from my coffee and smiled. Nanny sent me a letter with the tea. They're doing well, and Lau is going strong, despite his age. Still walks upright and everything. Henry made a face. Does he still insist that salt beef is rotten? I chuckled. He did last time I saw him. Drives the church crazy, too. For a man who grew up in a heathen country, he can quote the Bible better than anyone, especially with regards to diet. Henry laughed. That does explain why your father loves the man so much. I shrugged. His health did improve after following Lau's advice regarding food. All of ours did. Henry leaned in conspiratorially. Have you ever actually confirmed whether or not he really is a believer? I shook my head with a laugh. Henry himself questioned whether he believed in a God, but he did love a bit of local gossip. His answer has yet to change, and let me tell you, it drives a few less reputable members of the church crazy. What's more, they can't do anything about it because he's so much smarter. Heavens, I love that man. After sharing what little I knew of my hometown gossip with Henry, I set out along the moors. I decided to head in a different direction, toward Laughter Hall, then circle back around to Merripit House. I comfortably made my way across the moor. It was a barren, yet beautiful place, the signs of spring making themselves known. I saw stray sheep and a few herdsmen in the distance, but met no one. Eventually I saw the hills where the prehistoric huts that had been mentioned lay. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began to make my way toward them, only to freeze. There, standing atop one of the hills, was a man in silhouette. I knew well that with the distance I was at, the man was likely much smaller than he appeared, but I decided that it would be safer to turn and continue on my way. I was not about to meet with Selden alone, pistol or no. I warily made the rest of my way to Laughter Hall, where one of Henry's neighbors was supposed to live, and was met at the gate by an old man beckoning to me wildly. He opened the gate and gestured for me to step through. Get in here! Get in here! My gracious girl, do you have a death wish? There's a known murderer on the moors, and you're just traipsing about unawares. You have no idea how glad I was to see you notice the man and turn back this way. Taken aback, I blinked. Are you Mr. Frankland? He grasped my arm and pulled me in toward the house. Yes, I am, and you're that lady doctor. Let me tell you, you have no business being a doctor. That's bad enough, but going to war of all things. Yes, you must have a death wish. I was uncertain how to respond to this man. He seemed annoyed and horribly worried at the same time, though his attitude toward my profession was one that I was accustomed to. I'll have you know, sir, that I wanted to get an English degree, but my parents told me that it would be a waste of my talents and forced me into medicine. This was only half true. I had wanted the English degree when I was quite young, and had changed my mind early, but my parents had always insisted that I use them as an excuse to leave uncomfortable situations. This half-truth did little to soothe Mr. Frankland, who shook his head. That would never have happened if you were my daughter. I don't approve of such goings-on. I assumed you showed an aptitude for medicine, and they decided to cash in. My word, the number of despicable people in this world is far too great. But come in and sit down, have some tea. I wasn't certain if I liked or despised Mr. Frankland. He had a manservant who brought us some tea, and when it was served he looked at me severely. What is a young woman like you doing living with a gentleman with no chaperone? I wanted to laugh. So there indeed were some people who still cared about such things during a war. Wanting to soothe his nerves, I decided to lie a little as I did earlier. Henry is a cousin of mine. He needed some care after returning from the front, and it was pure serendipity that I was in London. I assure you, Mrs. Barrymore is keeping a close eye on the both of us. My eyes sparkled with amusement, but this lie did seem to calm him. He settled himself in his chair, giving off the air of a preening old rooster. Well, I suppose that is acceptable enough, but why haven't you returned to America, then? Is it submarines? I nodded with mock solemnity that he failed to note. My uncle is afraid for my safety if I attempt to return before they have been dealt with, and I'm afraid I still haven't recovered my full strength. Franklin stood and walked over to a large pile of newspapers and pulled one out, waving it in front of me. I'll say you haven't, gadding about with the police to uncover murderers. Such a stubborn girl. You wouldn't be doing anything like that if you were my daughter. Mentally I responded that I was quite glad I was not his daughter, if he went about hoarding and obsessing over all the papers in London. But I held my tongue on that matter. It was a special request from the Red Cross offices. We didn't have anyone else. This seemed to placate him. This damned war is ruining everything. My daughter is now doing more work than ever, you know." He tisked and glared at the wall, then abruptly changed the subject. "I suppose you're wondering why I pulled you in here so abruptly, aren't you? The fact of the matter is, I make it my business to make certain everything in Devon is as it should be. After all, who else is going to?" He shifted in his chair and huffed. "I was looking out across the moors with my telescope. Yes, I have one in the observatory. I'll show you in a minute. I caught sight of that murderer out among those huts. I saw him yesterday, too. I told the government that they should be torn down, but the magistrate won't look at any of my cases until the war is over. Have you ever heard such nonsense? The things I sue about are just as vital to the war as anything else, but he won't even glance at my cases. I decided then that I didn't like Mr. Franklin. Now, I saw that murderer again, and just as I'm getting ready to go to the police, who do I see wandering about but your delicate personage? Dr. Mortimer had told me that you were here, and I knew it was my public duty to get you safe and away from that murderer." There were many things I wanted to say, but I forced out a thank you. He puffed with pride. "Men aren't raised like they used to. If I were your host, I would never have let you come to Devon with a murderer on the loose." I decided it was better that he didn't know how hands-off Mycroft Holmes was when it came to my management. "At any rate, I won't be letting you out of here until it's good and safe, and even then I'll see you home myself." I shook my head. "I'm not sure that's necessary. Besides, I was going to go and call upon Miss Stapleton." Franklin rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Stapleton, eh? I suppose that's safe enough, though I will be escorting you there. Then Stapleton can see you back to the hall. I do have suits to prepare for once the war is over, and they do keep me busy. Now, let's go check the safety of the moors, shall we?" I followed Franklin into his observatory, where a beautiful telescope stood. I gave a little gasp. It was truly a beautiful instrument of shining brass. Franklin noticed my gasp, and a look of pride settled about his face. "Beautiful, isn't she? Top of the line. Go ahead and look through her. She's already aimed at the Tor." I did as he said, expecting to see nothing, but instead I once more saw a man, standing tall, hat pulled low over his face, in a dark coat. A young boy ran up to him with a small parcel, then ran off. "Well, is there anything?" I was perturbed. I did not particularly want to stay here with this strange little man, but if this was indeed the Notting Hill murderer, I did not want to travel home alone. Just as he said this, however, the man dipped out of sight. Sorry, there's no one. I was just entranced by the beautiful view." Franklin pushed me gently, attempting to get closer to his beloved telescope. Let me see." I prayed that the man would stay out of sight long enough to convince Franklin, and my prayer came true. "Very well, then, I will see you to Merripit House." Part 15. The walk to Merripit House was an odd one. The old man walked slowly, arm in arm with me, regaling me about his favorite lawsuits. "Once I proved that the country had infringed upon the people's right to wonder. It was a terrible situation. The people loved me for that." I came to realize that the man was rather amusing, if, that is, you didn't particularly care about anything. We were met at the gate of Merripit by Jack Stapleton. "Mr. Franklin, Dr. Watson, won't you join us for a bit of lunch?" Franklin shook his head. "Dr. Watson will, but I must get back to my suits, and make sure you see her home now. The moors are no place for a young lady alone." He said his goodbyes and began to walk off. Stapleton gave me a sympathetic smile. "Has he been regaling you with his lawsuits?" I nodded. "The man practically kidnapped me off of the road and seemed rather concerned about me going about by myself." Stapleton looked hesitant for a moment. That's likely because of his daughter. Do come in and have some lunch with Beryl and I, and I'll explain." Beryl turned out to be the tall, dark woman that Lestrade and I had met on the road. She looked at me with a brief look of surprise, which she lost just as swiftly. "Beryl, this is Dr. Watson. Dr. Watson, this is my sister Beryl." Never had two siblings looked more different, one being so dark and one so fair, though at the time I supposed that, had there been a third sibling, their parentage would have shone through. as was the case for my sisters and me. Stapleton launched into apologies on behalf of Mr. Frankland over lunch. "You must excuse Mr. Frankland's behavior. He's estranged from his daughter, you see, and he has a tendency to be rather controlling of the other girls on the moor." I shook my head sadly. "Whatever happened?" Stapleton sighed and looked at Beryl. "Well, I don't know all of the details, but her name is Laura Lyons now. She was being courted by a less than desirable man, and Franklin, well, he forbade her from marrying him. It may have worked if she weren't just as stubborn as her father. She married the man, and he ran off less than a year later. She was left destitute, and she was too stubborn to ask her father for help. A subscription was set up to help get her established in Coombe Tracy as a typist, and from what I hear she's doing much better. She set out for London right around the time of Sir Charles' death. Last I heard, she's working for the military. It seems they're desperate for them at the moment." I shook my head with a sigh. "I suppose her status as a married woman would help her there. They wouldn't know the reputation of her husband and won't have to worry about her running off to get married." Stapleton looked thoughtful. "You would know better than I would. My back is somewhat unreliable, I'm afraid, so I never got the chance to join the military." I smiled sympathetically. "So have you lived in Devon long?" Stapleton shook his head. "Only a few years now. I used to run a school in South America, but there was an outbreak and the whole thing was shut down. Then the war broke out, and I came back to England to serve, only to find out that I could not. I do what I can, though." He had a look that was not unlike guilt. I was accustomed to men who were unable to serve presenting this look around me, but something was off about the way it made itself known. On Stapleton's features, it seemed hard, almost stone-like, but this disappeared swiftly, and I decided to move on. I was about to change the subject when Beryl spoke. "Jack, it's nearly 1. Stapleton looked terribly startled and stood swiftly. "Ah, forgive me, Dr. Watson. It seems I have forgotten about an appointment I made. Beryl will see you home. She knows the moors just as well as I do." He said this while hurrying into his coat and out the door, while I looked at Beryl questioningly. She responded with only an apologetic smile. "Jack has a terrible habit of losing track of time. It's one of his worst vices, I'm afraid." This was all that was said for some time as I put on my coat and walked with the woman back to Baskerville Hall. Beryl eventually spoke, her soft voice soothing to the ears. "I do hope you will forgive my silly behavior the other day. I do tend to get superstitious. Jack says that it's my greatest vice." I looked at her as we walked, my cane planted firmly on the path with each step. "Miss Stapleton, I must be frank. If you have some reason to believe that Sir Henry is in danger, you must tell me so that I may deal with it straight away. I am not superstitious, and I will not have my old friend coming to harm." She shook her head vigorously, but seemed reticent. "I only know that the legend is very convincing, and every head of Baskerville seems to have died of some fright. Sir Charles' father died out on the moor. They found his body near the old tin mine. There wasn't a mark on him, but there was a print of a hound. It is said that the beastly thing can rip out a man's very soul." I shook my head. "I am unconvinced. Heart conditions run in families, and it is more than likely that Sir Charles' father had the same." She gave a faint smile. "Ah, of course, it was silly of me to try and warn him. But I do worry." We began passing the small grove of trees that I had made note of on my walk with Lestrade. "If you're that worried, I'll bring him down for dinner, as your brother insisted. He's a bit worn from being stationed in Italy, but he's healthy as an ox otherwise." Beryl looked hesitant, then nodded. "That would be lovely." Then we heard it, that long, low sound, and I suddenly recognized it, my mind finally recalling knowledge I never thought I would need in England. I suppose the moor does make strange sounds. Beryl Stapleton left me at the gate and made her way off, while I grimly made my way to Henry. I came upon him gifting his old clothes to Barrymore, mentioning something about tradition. "Henry, I think I know what that sound on the moor is." Henry looked at me in surprise. "I thought it was just gases and strange things escaping the mire." I shook my head. "Do you remember when my father and I took you hunting?" Recognition and concern crossed Henry's face. Yes, but what does that have to do with anything? I gave him a knowing look. You remember the wolf we heard? Henry gave me a horrified look. You don't think someone's brought an American wolf to Dartmoor? I threw my hands in the air. I don't know. For all I know, the thing is just some crossbreed brought over as a puppy before the war. Henry's face changed from horror to a grim set certainty. And now it's terrifying the countryside with its howls. I shook my head. Perhaps there's still a chance that it's just sounds from the mire. My words were less than convincing, and Henry's face showed it. We should find out for ourselves. Say, where's Barrymore? The butler had made his way out of the room at some point during our conversation. Henry, who seemed disgruntled, waved me in closer. Something's not right in this house. Has Holmes told you anything? I gave him Holmes' letter, which I'd kept in my pocket, and he looked concerned. Well, if Barrymore did care my uncle for money, he picked an odd way to do it, traumatizing his wife in the process. Bah! He threw the letter down to the table. Did you hear the crying again last night? I nodded. I couldn't be sure about what I was hearing, though. Henry shook his head, his eyes narrowing. I say we stay up tonight and listen in. I want to know what is going on. We, however, did not follow through on Henry's wish. Later that same day, Dr. Mortimer visited. He had planned to go down to Coombe Tracey and wanted to know if we would like to accompany him. Henry was rather worked up, and Mortimer convinced me that it would help to soothe his nerves, so down to Coombe Tracey we went. I wouldn't say we had a splendid time, but it did distract us for a while. Whilst there, I made a thorough report to Holmes in a letter. I did not know what he would do with the irrelevant information about Laura Lyons and Mr. Frankland, but I felt that, since I was unable to discern truth in the information, I should tell it all to the one who could. After mailing the letter, Henry and I spent the day at the local pub where the barkeep knew all the gossip that there was to be had, much to Henry's delight. So you're the new Lord of Baskerville Hall, are ye? Are you going to finish the work that your uncle started? Henry nodded. I hope to. I also want to put in a row of electric lights down that yew alley. The place is far too dark and gloomy. The barkeep nodded. Yeah, that's true enough. I always thought it strange that Miss Lyons would go there so often to talk to your uncle. A jolt of electricity ran through my nerves. I'm sorry, who visited Sir Charles? The barkeep shrugged, continuing to wipe a glass. Miss Lyons. The girl preferred older gentlemen, although, between you and me, I think she was trying to get him to pay for her divorce. Mighty unhappy, that girl was. But there, she's off to London now, managed to get an interview, and is making decent money for a lass. Doesn't need to bother the Baskervilles any more. A good thing for you, sir, he gestured at the story-bound Henry, for she's a mite pretty, and may be able to sway you off your beau here. He pointed a thumb at me, and both Henry and I laughed. No, Johanna and I aren't like that. She's my cousin and personal doctor. I have a few health issues, you know. I had always been amazed at Henry's ability to convincingly lie on the spot. The barkeep, however, looked a bit skeptical. Are you sure about that? She's too pretty for a home nurse. Henry pounced upon the source of amusement and, acting scandalized, came to my defense. How dare you, sir? Her honor is impeccable. Why, you wouldn't be questioning our relationship if she was ugly. I mean, just look at me. I just returned from Italy, and I have so many health issues and wounds that need far more care than a nurse can give. After treating soldiers at Paschadale, Dr. Watson has more knowledge than any other. Good day to you, sir. I say good day. Henry slammed his money down on the table and ushered me out of the bar just in time to prevent me from laughing hysterically. Dr. Mortimer, who had been visiting a patient in town, looked at us quizzically as we sat there in the street, composure lost to the wind, which only served to make us laugh more. It was late by the time we returned to Baskerville Hall, and we both forgot about our plans to stay up that night. Although, before going to bed, I did make a few notes, and Henry glanced at the mail that had arrived in our absence, which included a formal invitation to dinner at Merripit House the next day. I went to bed and fell into a deep sleep like I hadn't had in ages. The next morning at breakfast, Henry and I couldn't stop laughing. Every time I remembered his outburst, I had to bite my lip, which would set off Henry. Mrs. Barrymore did ask us what we were on about, but all I could get out was that it was a bit of an inside joke. You know, Watson, I could use some more exercise. Do Do you think that maybe it would be all right to go out and about the moor?" I raised a brow. "You're asking me?" Grinning, I laughed once more. "If we're together, it should be fine. Holmes only said that you shouldn't be alone, not that you should stay under house arrest. But," I lowered my voice, leaning into him, "you do have a service revolver, don't you?" Henry nodded. "Good. If someone did let a wolf dog loose on the moor, I think it's better that we're prepared." Henry leaned back in his chair and thought. "So it's likely that my uncle's death was a mere accident." I shook my head. "Someone tried to kill you, Henry." Henry blinked. "Oh yes, I had forgotten about that. Say, Johanna, you've been back longer than I have. Does it ever fade?" Hesitantly, I bit my lip. "I don't know, Henry. You were gone longer than I, and I'm a woman. These things affect us differently." Henry leaned in closer with a persistent look about his face that begged for an answer. "But has it faded at all for you? I mean, logically, I know that in London I shouldn't have been shot at, but I've grown so accustomed to it that I want to believe it was normal." Sighing, I gripped my cheek in my hand. "It hasn't for me, Henry." Henry and I went out on the moor after breakfast, engaging in what was a long heart-to-heart. War had changed us for better and worse. I was lucky, since I hadn't had to kill anyone, but we both had nightmares. "I do all right." We walked in the direction of the huts. "You know how I was before the war. You're one of the few who do." Henry smiled and wrapped his arm about my shoulders. "Sherlock Holmes hasn't sussed it out then, eh?" I shook my head with a laugh. "I'm certain that he suspects something. He would be a fool not to. Yet as brilliant as every member of that family may be, I'm afraid they're all rather unaware when it comes to matters of the spirit." Henry gave me a reproving look. "Come now, Joe, I know you hide it well, better than the soldiers I've seen with that face. It was heart-rending to see it on you that first time, even worse when I saw it on the men around me and understood the implications." I shook my head sadly. "You exaggerate. Henry, the soldiers, I'm sure, have it much worse off than I had it then." Henry, who always seemed agitated when we spoke of such things, clenched his fist. "Perhaps, but the ones I speak of were not children." We dined with the Stapletons that evening. Jack really was a charming fellow, and I knew that Henry was delighted by his sister's beauty. We were joined by Mr. Franklin, who, having also been invited, took the opportunity to berate Henry for allowing me to stroll about the moors alone. He went so far as expressing hope that Henry would be wiser in the future. Henry, who had to restrain himself from laughing, solemnly assented. "Of course, Mr. Franklin. After all, my dear Joe is fond of nightly walks. Under the circumstances, I couldn't possibly let her take them alone." Having warned him about Franklin's personality ahead of time, we had agreed not to rile him up more than was absolutely necessary. Henry, it seemed, decided not to abide by this agreement. Inspector Lestrade was also present, and he got on quite well with Henry, both heaping flattery upon the female Stapleton. I had caught a glance at Jack during one of these moments, and he looked rather annoyed. It was unsurprising, really. Had a group of men been accosting my sister in the same manner, my brother would have reacted the same. Stapleton seemed to notice me looking at him and gave me a smile, then spoke to Henry. "Have you and Dr. Watson been friends for very long?" Henry smiled. I had warned him of my lie to Franklin ahead of time. "We're cousins, though we didn't know each other very well till she did her residency in Canada, and I'm afraid I had to avail myself of her skills on several occasions. There's no better doctor than she, in my opinion. No offense, Mortimer." Mortimer, who had been more focused upon his dinner than on the conversation, glanced up in confusion at his name being spoken. "Ah, quite." Stapleton looked like he suddenly remembered something. "Speaking of, Dr. Mortimer, didn't you have a paper to give to Dr. Watson?" Mortimer nodded, his eyes brightening. "Ah, yes! I brought it with me tonight. I do hope you can find the time to read it over, Dr. Watson. I had to write it based upon second-hand accounts and interviews with returning front-line doctors. I really would appreciate your input." I gave Mortimer the most genuine smile I could manage. "Of course, Dr. Mortimer. It would be my pleasure." I really was less than enthused about the prospect. I knew that at some point I would have to start my own publications on the topic, but I had been hoping not to get involved quite so soon. Henry and I did not return to Baskerville Hall immediately that night. Lestrade had insisted upon seeing us back to the hall as we walked, and we once more heard that blood-curdling howl. Henry and I, who were both prepared with our revolvers, set out at once in the direction from which it came. Lestrade followed us in confusion. "What on earth are the two of you doing?" I held Henry's hand so we could stabilize each other as we walked. "I have reason to believe that the sound is being caused by a proper wolf." Lestrade scoffed indignantly. "Stuff and nonsense! There hasn't been a wolf in England for hundreds of years." I pursed my lips in annoyance. No wonder Holmes got so frustrated with the man. "I didn't say it was an English wolf, Lestrade." My comment silenced him for a while, and we made our way in silence until at last we reached the great Grimpen Mire. Henry and I froze upon noticing the change in terrain, but Lestrade kept walking, stepping straight into the ooze. Henry grasped him, and, with great effort, we pulled him back onto dry land before he could even cry out. "Be careful, man! You don't recognize waterlogged land when you see it?" Lestrade didn't have a chance to respond to Henry before we heard the howl again. "It's no use, Joe. We'll have to come back in the morning. There's no way we'll be able to get to the old tin mine this way." Lestrade, who was looking at Henry much in the same way he looked at Holmes, managed to finally speak. "How on earth can you say that sound is coming from the old tin mine? It seems to be coming from all directions to me." Henry looked down at him in what seemed to be pity mixed with disgust. "When you're constantly being shelled, you learn to pinpoint what direction the whistle comes from. What's more, there's no background noise here to drown out the howl." Lestrade returned with us to the hall, and Henry ensured that the man let his boots thoroughly dry before he left. "There's no use in your getting trench foot, especially not here, in Devon." Part 16. The next few weeks went by melancholic. Henry and I wanted to make our way to the tin mine, but were distracted by a number of happenings, not the least of which was finding Selden the murderer. Initially, we didn't set out because neither of us felt well after the evening with the Stapletons. It seemed that we had both taken cold after that evening spent on the moor. This really was unsurprising, considering that I was barely at a workable health, and Henry was freshly returned from the Italian front. We spent a few days depleting the tea that Nanny sent me, and planning. I sent all the information we had to Holmes by way of letters, including my suspicion that there was an American wolf on the moor. Holmes, who was not one to use a sentence where a single word would do, sent back a short reply. "Very good. Stay on guard. Holmes." This was all I would receive from Holmes for the foreseeable future, but I decided that it was enough. Henry was less enthused, but I assured him that Holmes was indeed paying attention, and, in the meantime, we would continue to conduct our own investigations. While we were laid up, Henry and I noticed that we often heard footsteps wandering the halls in the early hours of the morning. It also occurred to me that I hadn't once seen Barrymore wearing the clothes given him. After sufficient time for recovery had passed, I asked Henry, who was growing agitated from the inaction, if he wanted to set out upon the moor that night after Mortimer had come to call, and Henry agreed. If we went around by the back of his property, we would be able to walk around the mire and head straight for an old path which would lead directly to the mine. We did wind up going in this direction, but not for the reason that we had originally intended. When Henry and I made to set out late that night, we saw Barrymore heading down the hall in the direction that we had seen him come from. Henry motioned for me to follow, and we crept down the hall behind the man, watching as he began to wave his candlestick about in front of the window. I noticed Henry's temper flare as he drew in a breath and moved silently to the side, flinching as he bellowed. "Barrymore, what is this? You have served my family for years, and now I see you are about some evil in my house. Tell me what you are doing this instant!" Barrymore spun around, his face white and grimly set. "It is my own business, sir. I assure you it poses no danger to you." Henry, like most hot-tempered men, was not satisfied with a vague answer. "Not my business? Everything that occurs in this house is my business. Now tell me, what are you doing, and I may not see you out this very night?" Barrymore, to his credit, was unfazed by Henry's behavior and volume. If that is what you wish, sir, that is how it will be. Nevertheless, I will not divulge my business to you tonight." In the candlelight, Henry looked like he was about to turn purple. I would have stepped in had it not been for Mrs. Barrymore coming down the passage behind us.
"Wait, Sir Henry, wait. Please don't condemn my husband. Everything he has done has been for my sake. It is for me that he wishes to leave this place, and for me that he defies you. Just please listen to me."
Henry spun around to face the woman, who, like her husband, was fully dressed despite it being an hour where they should have been in bed. He calmed at the sight of the woman and steadied himself. "Very well. Tell me what is going on."
Mrs. Barrymore took a breath. "It's my brother. He is out on the moor, sir. My husband has been kind enough to take him food and clothes so that he would not starve or freeze."
Henry's already dark face darkened more. "And why did you think that I would not be agreeable to taking him in?" Mrs. Barrymore hesitated, then dropped her head.
"My maiden name is Selden, sir."
Henry and I were both taken aback by this twist of information.
"You have to understand, I'm his older sister. I'm afraid we spoiled him in the truest sense of the word. Mother had him at such an old age that we were all surprised. He began making terrible choices and breaking our hearts. I know well that he needs to pay for his crimes, but I can't help but see him as the little boy that I would rock to sleep at night. So my poor husband has been doing this for me, ensuring that my lost sheep of a brother was fed and clothed."
The story ended, and Henry and I looked at each other in dismay.
"You do realize that if anyone found you out, you would be charged with aiding a convict. You and your husband would be locked up for years, and that's if the courts took it easy on you."
It was I who spoke, unable to tolerate the silence that followed the revelation. Henry, having a soft spot for women, finally spoke. "Your husband has done you a great disservice by aiding you. The instant he knew of Selden's whereabouts, he should have reported him. Still, I will not cast either of you out. I can imagine it would be nigh impossible to break the heart of one's own wife. I will say no more of this, Barrymore, if you both agree to stop aiding Selden." Barrymore assented with a quickness that implied there was some relief to having his nightly acts made known, while his wife was visibly heartbroken. They left us in the hall, and Henry began staring out the window. "Do you see that, Joe?" I squinted, and in the dark there was the light of a flame.
"Where do you suppose that is?"
Henry was tense, his muscles seeming coiled as a spring, and I realized that he needed the relief of a fight. "Up on the Tor, probably. It can't be more than a couple of miles. Do you fancy yourself a hunt?" The horses that were kept in the stable were trained in the English style, which was not something to which I was accustomed, but I could manage. Henry had lent me a pair of trousers, and we set out to climb the Tor. I didn't fancy the idea of shooting a man, but I knew that I likely wouldn't have to, with the vigor that Henry had in his stance. We started out, and after a few minutes managed to understand the horses enough to get them to gallop. That's when we heard it, that low, melancholic howl, followed by a raving scream. The horses, to their credit, didn't react to the sound, so Henry and I urged them on faster before slowing the horses at the base of the Tor. We had begun to look for the path of ascent when we saw the body. There, lying on the ground, face down, was a man in Henry's clothes. I grimaced. "This certainly explains why Barrymore never wore the clothes you gave him." Henry pursed his lips. "You think this is Selden?" I rolled my eyes as sarcasm welled up inside me. "It's either him or a thief who robbed him." My sarcastic remark was punctuated with a howl, and we both looked up to where, in the outline of the moonlight, we saw what looked like a large dog which then slunk out of sight. Henry jumped down from his horse and slung the dead man over it before jumping back on. "Let's go." I followed Henry to the main road, where we found a policeman to whom we gave the body. They rather irritatedly asked why we had not left the body where we found it, and Henry replied in a dark and somewhat cryptic manner, "We've left enough bodies in the mire." They questioned us no further. We made our way back to the manor, where we were surprised to find the Stapleton siblings, one looking worried, the other annoyed, although the annoyance quickly disappeared. "Ah, there you are!" Stapleton grabbed my arm and led me to a seat. I grimaced, thinking that he was gripping much too hard. My facial expression went unnoticed, and Henry sunk into another chair beside me. Stapleton stroked my hand gently, which also caused me to grimace. When I heard from Barrymore that you two had gone for a midnight ride, I was beside myself with worry. Are you both all right? Henry noticed my discomfort and saved me. Johanna doesn't like to be touched, Jack. Yes, we're fine. The moonlight was so bright we decided to go for a ride. We were distracted by unexpected events. Stapleton's arm stiffened briefly at Henry's dark tone, but quickly resumed a neutral posture. Do forgive me, Dr. Watson. I'm afraid I've gotten so used to comforting my sister I've become a little too comfortable with women. Beryl Stapleton bit her thumb and hesitated before speaking. What happened? Henry smiled at her gently. You're likely to read about it in the papers soon enough. I don't feel like recounting it, and Watson and I could use a good long rest. The Stapletons took Henry's hint and left, but something occurred to me too late to ask. What were they doing here so late? Henry and I got that good rest we needed, though surprisingly not in our beds. After the Stapletons left, Henry and I moved to the couch that sat in front of the fire, enjoying the heat that radiated from it. There we simply enjoyed each other's company and fell asleep, leaning on each other. It was a better sleep than I had had in ages, though I wasn't so certain Henry could say the same. We both eventually awoke and sat down to a late breakfast. Barrymore looked hesitant as he served us. Sir, I do believe I need to make a confession. Henry, whose spirit had been revived after a long nap, turned to Barrymore, his eyes flashing with a fire that made me wary. What is it now? Barrymore pulled a small piece of paper out of his pocket, handing it to Sir Henry. When I was cleaning Sir Charles' office, I found this. It may explain why he was in the yew alley. The paper was burnt around the edges. Only a piece of what must have been originally there remained. And why did you not give it to the police? Barrymore's shoulders fell. I did not want them around any longer than necessary, sir. Henry sighed, then waved him off. I won't condemn you over a mistake you made for love of your wife. Thank you for telling me now. Barrymore bowed low, then left the room. Joe, I don't know whether to beg them to stay on or work harder to get them replaced. I returned his wry smile. A woman is blessed to have a man like him. Henry shook his head. He made the wrong decision. He should have talked some sense into his wife. I smiled sadly. I don't deny that, but it is nice to know there are men in the world who are so gentle and loving that they would go to any length to prevent their wives from experiencing heartbreak. Henry gave me a sympathetic look, then glanced over the note in question. What was left of it simply read, so that I may thank you properly in the yew alley, L.L. Henry frowned. What do you make of it, Joe? I thought quietly for a moment, frustration filling the void in my mind. I'm not sure. I feel as though I should know something, though. Ah, blast. I'll write to Holmes. He's more than likely able to give us an answer. In the meantime, what do you plan on doing with the rest of your afternoon? Henry smiled. Engage in as little excitement as possible. I laughed and patted his shoulder. Ah, so more financial paperwork, then. I wrote my letter to Holmes and sent it to the office by way of the young maid who was headed in that direction. I then took up the manuscript that Dr. Mortimer had given me and made my way to the sofa in Henry's office, reading it while Henry went over his work. It was late in the evening when Henry gave a groan. What is the use of being rich if I only have to do more math than I ever did as a farmer? I laughed. Would you like some help? Henry pursed his lips. No, I would like some amusement. I raised a brow. I thought you had enough excitement for one day. I received a glare which had little effect, given that it was from a face half squished against a desk. Right. But there is little to amuse me in this publication. Dr. Mortimer may be a skilled doctor, but he writes in the most mind-numbing manner I've ever read, even for a treatise. Henry let out another sigh, then paused. You know, Johanna, I think I want to court Beryl Stapleton. I looked at Henry bemused and surprised by the idea. And what about her behavior makes you think she would ever be open to that idea?" Henry waved his hand. "Nothing, nothing, but she is a kind woman, very beautiful. I think I should like to have her as a wife." I let out a laugh. Henry had always been like this, rather old-fashioned in ways of the heart. I couldn't blame him. I was the same way about these things. I always believed that any marriage could succeed if only you were honest about your intentions with the other gender. Flattery is a dangerous thing, and no woman should marry any man who does nothing but flatter her. Butterflies and romance are nice enough, but you have to keep a firm head on your shoulders, or married life will become miserable. Henry and I had talked it over back in Canada, and we almost agreed to marry, but I was set on not marrying at all unless I could find a man who wasn't hot-tempered like my father. I didn't have the necessary grit to counter such a thing. War was one thing, but marriage is forever. "I'll be happy to play chaperone to any courting you may wish to do." Henry glanced up with a hopeful look in his eyes. "I don't suppose you would let me alone to do my own courting?" I gave Henry the same look I often got from Holmes. "Henry, there's a man out to kill you, and the person trying to prevent that eventuality specifically told me to never let you alone." Henry crossed his arms sullenly and pouted. "It was never leave me alone, but I get it." I laughed and returned to Mortimer's publication. I should have been more on my guard, but I'm afraid I got complacent, because I had received a telegram from Holmes in response to my letter. "I will look into it. S.H." Days passed, and Henry and I spent them wandering with the moors. We heard no more howls, though Mortimer did come to us in a frenzy one day, saying his dog was missing. We spent 2 days searching, but found nothing. The poor man was rather broken up about it, and knowing the love of a good dog, I promised to keep searching, which I did. Unfortunately, I neglected my duty to keep an eye on Henry in the process, whom I found one day with Beryl Stapleton. I debated with myself whether or not to ride out and retrieve him, or simply watch from a distance. He was on foot, and I on horseback, with a good view of everything around him, so I decided that waiting would be fine. I settled in and watched as Henry was saying something to Beryl, likely some form of wooing. The woman was visibly uncomfortable, even at the distance I watched from. Henry leaned down, perhaps to whisper in her ear, perhaps to kiss her. I decided that I would let Henry accost her no longer, and was about to move forward when I saw the distinct figure of Jack Stapleton rushing at them from the opposite direction. I couldn't see his features, but his shaking arms and bobbing head were enough to know that he was angry. I leaned back in my saddle and watched as the two men spoke to each other before Jack grabbed his sister by the arm and pulled her off, leaving behind a dejected Henry. I spurred on my horse and came up alongside him. "That's what you get for leaving the house in secret." Henry glanced up at me with a fire in his eyes, but it died swiftly. "It seems the whole world is out to watch me do my wooing." I rolled my eyes. "Your wooing was awkward and crude. She was clearly uncomfortable, Henry." Henry, with a strained maneuver, leapt up onto the horse behind me. "Yes, I suppose I was being too aggressive. She is rather attached to her brother." I snorted, "And he to her. They are strangely close." Henry was holding my shoulders and watching the ground, but I noticed a glint and once more saw a man on the tor. This unnerved me as we rode back to the hall. If the man just standing there wasn't Selden, and neither was he a policeman, then who could he possibly be? I toyed briefly with the idea that it may be Franklin, but shook it away. I may be seeing the man at a distance, but I had seen the man well with Franklin. It occurred to me that perhaps it may be different men at different times, so it could be Franklin now, and perhaps Stapleton the day I looked through the telescope. But that wasn't right either. Neither man would look so very tall up there, even at this distance. Henry was despondent for a few days. He had gone sullen and silent, and would only make grunting remarks. I, being used to this behavior, just put up with it. He would come around eventually, and I was not going to encourage his mood. This behavior ended after I went to the post office one day. I had written to Holmes that the mysterious man on the tor was starting to agitate me. I had been so certain that it must have been Selden, and was starting to entertain the ludicrous idea that I should go find out who it was myself. Upon returning from the post office, I encountered Jack Stapleton leaving the manor. The man tipped his hat to me and walked on down the path. I rushed in to see Henry, where I found him in a rather good mood, smoking a cigar. This was unusual, as Henry almost never smoked, his mother hating the habit. "Since when do you smoke?" Henry grinned almost triumphantly. "Since receiving this lovely cigar as an apology from Stapleton. Apparently his outburst was because he and his sister have never been apart from each other, and the thought of her getting married drove him to near insanity for a moment. He came back and made a lovely apology and said that, as long as I was willing to take things slow for his sake, he would allow the courtship. Isn't that wonderful?" I thought back upon the body language of the woman in question. I suppose my thoughts must have shown on my face, because Henry spoke again. "Don't get any bad ideas, Joe. I can be as gentle with her as I was befriending you." I gave Henry a concerned smile. "I don't doubt that, Henry, but I made my position clear to you very early on. I get the feeling that something is preventing her from speaking her true feelings." Henry scoffed. He was willing to believe in women's intuition when it was convenient for him to do so, but he otherwise refused to entertain the thought. We called upon the Stapletons that night. They, having finally heard about Selden, were concerned greatly for Henry. "How on earth did the man get a hold of your old clothes?" Henry shook his head. "It seems he stole them when they had been hung out to wash. It's unnerving knowing that the man was so close, but comforting to know he can do no further harm." Stapleton seemed agitated. "What do you think made him jump off the cliff?" Franklin, who had arrived shortly after we did, and seemed to be annoyed at not being the center of attention, spoke up. "Insanity, probably. Staying out on the moors as long as he had would get to the mind of anyone, especially with the sounds made by the mire. The man probably thought the devil himself was after him." Mortimer, who had eaten his meal in silence until now, nodded. "I agree with Franklin. The man spent night after night alone. That is apt to drive anyone to madness." Mortimer accompanied us home that evening. Little was said until we got to the hall. Henry had been developing a mood ever since leaving, and it finally made him speak, his lips turning up into a sneer. "You know, I wonder why a man would so desperately want me dead." I shook my head with a sigh. "Is it not obvious? Money. It's always money in some way or another. Mortimer, who would have the most to gain from Henry's death?" Mortimer thought for a moment before answering. "I suppose it would be the unknown heir, but we don't even know if he's alive." Henry and I looked at each other in surprise, and my gut tightened. "What unknown heir?" Mortimer, who seemed unaware of Henry's and my sudden tension, explained. "Sir Charles had 2 brothers, the middle being Sir Henry's own father, and the younger striking out to South Africa. It was said that he had a son, but we couldn't locate him." I took a deep breath. "Is he in the line of succession?" Mortimer nodded. "After Sir Henry, of course. Initially, when we couldn't find Sir Henry, we tried to trace this cousin, but we were never able to find him. Eventually, we found Sir Henry in Italy, and it became a moot point." I bit my thumb in thought as Henry became more agitated. "Did you tell any of this to Holmes?" Mortimer shook his head. "Ah, no, I didn't think it relevant." Henry stood, stepping toward Mortimer, with his hands balled in fists as he roared, "Not relevant?" I stood firm. "Henry." He glanced at me, then closed his eyes, grabbing the decanter of whiskey Barrymore had set out on the table and downing the whole thing swiftly. "I'm going to bed, Joe. You explain to this idiot how belief in irrelevance is the entire reason this war has been hell." Mortimer sat in stunned silence while I finished my coffee. He finally found the courage to speak after I downed the final drops. "I see that I've made a mistake, but surely we have time to contact Sherlock Holmes with this information." I stared at him, pity and disgust filling my mind. "Mortimer, Henry has fought the Austrians in Italy. Nothing, no single piece of information is ever irrelevant. To neglect any information is to condemn men to death. Perhaps this time it will work out, but it is Henry's life that is on the line, and you have just done to him what his generals and politicians have been doing throughout this entire blasted war. You will be lucky if he finds it in his heart to be polite to you, let alone forgive you." Mortimer's downtrodden face almost touched my heart. I didn't know. I'm so sorry." I shook my head. "Tell that to him. Anybody who has never been to the front lines can never truly know. They can't understand the effect that it has on those of us who are condemned to a life of nightmares because we dared to assist in the fight for good. But anyways, I'm not completely innocent of complacency myself. Come, we are going for a ride. It was late when we set out, I having taken the time to write a letter to Holmes, intent on updating and sending it in the morning. The moon was clear and high, a surprise given the time of year, but a welcome one. Mortimer meekly followed me to the stables and assisted me onto a horse, taking one himself. Before leaving, I instructed Barrymore to keep a close eye on Henry. He had indeed gone to bed, but not before taking even more whiskey. It seemed that the events of the past weeks were beginning to snap his waning nerves. We rode silently in the moonlight. I, not wanting any particular amount of conversation, rode straight for the prehistoric huts as I fingered my revolver. I would find out just who exactly this mysterious man on the tour was. Part 17. Mortimer, who had trailed behind me for some time, nervously pulled up next to me. His hands clenched the reins, and his voice wavered. "Where are we going?" Annoyance filled me when he spoke, and my tone was sharp. "We are going to confront a suspect." Mortimer's breath hitched as he spoke. "What?" I shook my head, trying to clear the disgust the man's cowardice was filling me with. "For some time I have been seeing a man up among the prehistoric huts. Initially I thought it was Selden, but, seeing as he's dead, I expect that it may be this mysterious cousin. After all, where else would be a better place to hide a large American wolf? Where else could one get such a view? This is either the murderer or a vagrant, and we are going to find out which." I could feel the horror etched in Mortimer's face. The air was tense, and we were yet far from the huts. "Dr. Watson, I must protest. You are in no shape to—" I cut him off sharply. "That's why I brought you. I would have had Henry come with me, but, as you saw from his outburst, there's a strong likelihood that he would shoot first and ask questions later. And, on the off chance that this person is just a homeless vagrant, I would like to avoid such a situation." Mortimer shook his head, his voice quavering. "I am not convinced." It was then that I realized just how sheltered a person this Dr. James Mortimer was, and I sighed. "You're welcome to head home and leave me to my own devices, Mortimer. I do have my pistol, so it's not as though I am completely without defense." This had the intended effect of shaming Mortimer into silence. "So you'll stay then? Wonderful. I would rather avoid having to make this confrontation alone." We had to dismount when we reached the huts, which only served to deepen Mortimer's nervous energy. I lit the lantern I had brought. The moon served well enough outside, but in the huts its lights would likely dissipate. Carefully we moved together through the ancient settlement, creeping along the path. I kept a tight grip on Mortimer's wrist to ensure that he froze when I did, which occurred many times. There were footprints and the remnants of cigarettes, which proved nothing except that which I already knew. My lip turned up in a sneer as disgust ran through me. I had been blessed these last few weeks, as Henry was not a smoker, believing like his mother that it was a filthy habit which provided nothing to one's quality of life. It seemed that whatever acceptance I had managed to gain regarding the habit was now wiped out. Coming upon one of the more intact huts, I saw that there was a woolen blanket hanging over the entrance. Mortimer looked at me with dread, but I prepared to speak. It has been noted that I can take on a rather deep voice at times. Add into this the raspy quality that it takes when I shout, and it has, on occasion, led to my being mistaken for a man until I was seen. I proceeded to take full advantage of it for this situation. Or at least I would have, had not a voice proceeded to scare us out of our skins. "My dear Watson, do come inside before you catch your death of cold." You could have knocked me over with a feather. "Holmes?" In shock, I pulled back the blanket to see my friend sitting at a fire with his pipe in his mouth. I let go of Mortimer's wrist, stunned to the point of spluttering. "What? How?" Holmes' face spread with a smile that I could only find infuriating. "I'm certain you're confused, my dear. Do both of you sit, and I will explain. Dr. Mortimer does look faint." I turned to gaze upon my companion's face, just in time to watch him collapse to the ground. After getting my companion situated, I shook my head. This explains why he was found unfit for duty, but what about you, Holmes? Why are you here, of all places? Holmes looked at me lazily. I could be asking that of you, Watson. What has brought you here to the Tor in the middle of the night when you should be watching Sir Henry? I gave Holmes a look of irritation and waved my hand vaguely in the direction of Baskerville Hall. Henry is fine. He drank 2 tumblers of whiskey and went to bed. Holmes looked genuinely concerned by this news. And why, pray tell, did he do that? I flicked Mortimer's shoulder in my irritation. Because this sodding fool forgot to inform us that there is a missing heir. I think Henry is getting to the point where he wants someone to attack him in broad daylight just so he can rid the world of them. His stress is as much as it was on the front. I was going to telegram you in the morning, but I see now that's pointless. Holmes went silent for a moment, his pipe letting off puffs of smoke as I looked around. The hut was dim and bleak, the warmth of the fire being its only friendly attribute. Off to one side there were a few knapsacks, which I assumed to contain his necessities, and a bedroll against one wall in the corner. Briefly my heart twisted in sympathy, remembering the hard sleeping conditions I experienced on the front. Then my mind flared with rage as I realized how long he must have been here. And what exactly is the point of all this, Holmes? Why have you bothered to rely upon me if you've been watching us from the Tor this whole time? Have you even been receiving my letters? Holmes gave me a look that seemed a mix of surprise and disappointment. Why, Watson, it has been of the utmost importance that the murderer not know I was here. You do remember that I wrote you that he knew I had taken the case. If I made my presence public, he wouldn't dare to make a move until I left. As for your letters— He paused and removed a packet from his jacket pocket. I spoke to the post office and had them rerouted to a hotel in Coombe Tracy. I assure you that none of them were ever postponed more than a day. I bit my lip. Fury still filled my soul, despite this reasonable explanation. Be that as it may, why didn't you at least tell me of the situation? I would have felt very different about this whole ordeal knowing that you were nearby. Holmes smiled gently. My dear Watson, if I told you where I was staying, do you honestly believe that you would be able to resist bringing me some creature comforts? I froze, my mind slowing as I considered reality. I would like to think that my integrity would prevent me from endangering one of my dearest friends. I would do nothing to hinder the protection of Henry's life. I crossed my arms, firmly believing in my answer. Holmes contemplated my answer for a moment, but his face revealed nothing more. Perhaps that is true. Still, it is better not to risk temptation at all. Watson, surely you can agree with that? With your time spent on the front, and your natural inclination to care for those around you, you would have been heavily distracted knowing where I was and of my living conditions. He pointed to my hand, which rested on Dr. Mortimer's head, and I knew him to be right. Acceptance came to me, and I let out a resigned sigh. I don't think I've ever met a person who expected as little of me as you do. Holmes raised a brow. Watson, my standards are quite high regarding those I choose to associate with. You've performed a difficult job admirably. It would be unwise to expect more from you. For the first time in a long time, I felt that burning pressure in my throat. I wanted to cry. I wouldn't, but I wanted to. How relieving it was to be by the side of someone who did not expect the performance of miracles to be your base standard of adequacy. I took a breath and steadied myself. Well, since I can't leave until Mortimer wakes up, I suppose you should catch me up on what you've been doing while I've been minding Henry. Holmes was very short and concise with what he had been doing over these few weeks. After finding out from the cabby the name of the man that had attempted to shoot Sir Henry, he then proceeded to find not only the hotel, but the exact paper that the warning note had been cut from. It took a couple of days, but I paid a boy to go through the waste paper baskets of all the hotels that offer the Times. He eventually found one only a few streets over that had the paper. Holmes then ascertained which room that basket had come from and asked to see the ledgers of those staying that night. The names on the ledger were Mr. and Mrs. Donnell, clearly a fake name, but since we know that the shooter was a man, we know the sender of the letter was a woman. I shook my head in confusion. How can you be sure of that? Holmes smiled, lighting a cigarette and bringing it to his lips. Because, Watson, the letter was sent from the hotel. It is highly unlikely that the killer himself would warn off his quarry, so clearly the woman with him must have been the one to send it. I thought for a moment. Then the woman with him doesn't approve of the man's actions. Holmes smiled. Very good, Watson. After finding this information, I followed you to the moors where I have been watching from afar. Your conclusion that the howling is in fact a wolf is quite intriguing. I had been wondering about the leads now for some time, and finally asked about them. But what about Laura Lyons? Holmes took another drag from his cigarette. I hoped you would ask. I did speak with Miss Lyons, and she revealed something intriguing. It seems that Charles Baskerville pulled some strings to get her a position, and she wanted to thank him properly in private, so she made an appointment with him to meet the night of his death, but... I cut him off as I gleaned the answer. She never made it to the appointment. He nodded with a smirk. It seems that she received a telegram to come to London straight away on the evening train, but when she had arrived, no one had sent it. She intended to return the next day and apologize to Sir Charles, only to hear of his death. She kept quiet because she didn't want to incriminate herself, but has felt quite guilty ever since. I took a deep breath and checked Mortimer's pulse. He was fine, but it was an action that steadied me when I was feeling overwhelmed. And you are certain she was telling the truth? Holmes smiled amusedly. She was a strikingly beautiful woman, Watson. The station master remembered her. It would be hard not to, really, what with that fair complexion and eyes like the sea, with all the green and blue that were in them. I sighed in annoyance. It seems that my friend was truly like all other men, despite his apparent distaste for romance. I noted that Mortimer was beginning to stir. Do you want me to take Mortimer and leave you here, then? Holmes shook his head. Not at all, Watson. I will join you at the Hall now. I have a few more things to clear up before we return to London. Mortimer came to and gazed at Holmes in astonishment. Why, Mr. Holmes, what are you doing on the moor? Holmes, who looked upon Mortimer with the same disdain that one might look at a drawing which isn't turning out quite right, sniffed. I have already explained that to Watson, but for now I believe I will assist the good doctor in getting you home. We did eventually get Mortimer back on a horse, but it required that I get on first so that he might wrap his arms about my waist. I was grateful for the dim light that the lantern provided, as it hid the discomfort upon my face. How shameful it felt to be so disgusted by an action made out of necessity. The night air was cool, and I found myself realizing that the adrenaline I had been relying on to see me through the night was beginning to wane, and pain was setting in. I took a deep breath. I would be able to make it to Mortimer's house, and I did so. We dropped the still dazed Mortimer with his housekeeper, who seemed rather annoyed at being woken up so late into the night. Holmes seemed lost in thought as we set out toward the Hall, and I was content to let him think. I was still rather flustered by the whole situation and needed to get my emotions under control. It wasn't right to be upset with Holmes when everything he was doing was for Henry's sake, so any discordant feelings were to be snuffed like a candle and put away. I had grown quite comfortable with the silence when Holmes suddenly spoke. Watson, what are the conditions with regards to your discomfort with touch? The question, coming seemingly from out of nowhere, made me start so badly that I worried my horse. Where did that come from? It was almost a hiss. I had not expected Holmes to be concerned with such a thing at all. Holmes, seemingly ignoring my reaction, continued. You were quite comfortable when Henry embraced you, and you seemed comfortable enough asking for assistance when walking, but you were clearly in agony with Mortimer on your horse, and Mary mentioned that whenever she brushed your hair you cringed as though you were in pain. Yet Henry stroking your hair elicited nothing. I simply wished to understand you better. This heartfelt inquiry made me sigh internally. I was not one to show my heart easily to others, and had learned well that the most frequent result from that was heartbreak. I had hoped that Holmes was like me in this regard, but it seemed that he actually cared. For a moment I began to wish that the war had not brought so much attention to the human mind. I sighed audibly before speaking. Holmes, it's a matter of trust. Despite the moonlight being insufficient to see features, I could almost feel Holmes raise his brow in questioning. I have very sensitive skin. If someone touches me, I can feel that touch for hours after they have gone. For this reason, I don't care for people touching me who have not earned my deepest confidence. It feels as though... I paused, conflicted, searching for the right words to manifest my feelings on the matter. As though I am selling myself. I don't feel as though just anyone should be allowed into my space. It's the worst with my scalp. It makes me feel so vulnerable to have anyone but me touch it if I haven't been built up to have explicit faith in them. Only a select few have done so, Henry being one of them. Holmes made a humming sound of acknowledgement. And may I ask just what it was that earned him this trust? I laughed, trying to clear my discomfort. You may not. I don't like to share, Holmes. This was the most candid I had been in a while, and while ideally I would not have to be so for quite a while after, I shook my head. As long as the Holmes household thought that I was afflicted with shell shock, they would likely try various treatments on me. We returned to find Baskerville Hall in a state of agitation. Henry had apparently never gone to sleep despite his drunken state, and upon finding out that Mortimer and I had gone out in the night, insisted on following us. Holmes and I made it to the stables in time to see Sir Henry mounting, or attempting to mount, a horse. He gave up upon seeing me and ran over to my horse, practically yanking me off as I dismounted. "Where have you been? You could have been killed!" He had set me down, but his hands were tight about my shoulders. I had seen Henry like this only once before, but I knew what to do. When confronted with a man in such a state, I knew there was only one thing to do. I felt my facial muscles relax as all emotion went out of them, and I lied through my teeth. Holmes sent me a telegram to meet him at the station. We dropped Mortimer off at his home. Henry's moods seemed to change instantly. He let go of my shoulders, but didn't acknowledge Holmes, whose tense stance indicated he was prepared to intervene. "Oh, God, Watson, He trailed off. His tone had gone much softer. His eyes glanced at Holmes, then back to mine. "I'll have Mrs. Barrymore prepare Holmes a room. Johanna, please go get some rest. You had me worried." I was genuinely surprised at his ability to shift so suddenly, as my own father, who never drank, couldn't come out of a mood so swiftly. Nevertheless, as the exertions of the night suddenly filled my body with exhaustion, I nodded. "Holmes can bring you up to speed, Henry. We'll start on a new plan in the morning." The following conversation I was not privy to, and was only informed of it much later by Holmes. The two men had retired to Henry's study, the aforementioned man resting his face in his hands. "Did you see it, Holmes?" Holmes, sitting across from Henry and smoking his pipe, raised his brow at the man across from him. "If you are referring to the rather lifeless look Watson's face took on when you screamed at her, yes, it seems the war has left her rather scarred." Henry raised his bloodshot eyes to Holmes and gave a scoffing laugh. "That wasn't the front, Holmes. She's always had that look, at least as long as I've known her, though I didn't quite understand the full ramifications of it till recently." Holmes, who had taken another drag from his pipe, took it from his mouth. "Choose your next words with care, Sir Henry. Watson has made it clear that she is not yet comfortable sharing her past with me." Henry shook his head. "It's true that she doesn't like sharing her past, but she doesn't care if others do it for her. It saves her the trouble of getting upset when being questioned." Holmes raised a brow, but said nothing. "I need to speak. My mind is chaos, and nothing. It's like there's a brick in my head. I need to speak." Holmes stared at Sir Henry for a moment, then took a drag from his pipe. "Speak, then." Henry let out a sigh and placed his head in his hands. "Jo and I met while she was on her medical placement. A friend had brought me to the hospital, and, as it turns out, they were cousins. The three of us had a grand time together, going to dances and concerts as often as we could manage. I had thought myself to be courting her. You see, despite her being a doctor, her immediate family was rather humble. I had it all planned out. I could continue to farm, and she could be a countryside doctor." He paused and shifted his shoulders. Holmes gave Henry an amused smile. Did you ever consult Watson about this line of thought? Henry laughed. I did. She said that she really wasn't interested at the moment, but to inquire again after she was completely finished with her schooling. Holmes nodded. So she was rather inclined toward you, then. What went wrong? Henry's face strained. She saw me get angry. It seemed so odd at the time, as it wasn't even directed at her. I had gotten into a rather loud disagreement with a fellow from a society that Malinois and I were members of, and Watson just happened to walk in on it. Her face just went white and lifeless, just as you saw tonight. At the time, I thought it odd, but just chalked it up to her really hating the noise. She squashed all dreams of matrimony then and there, told me plainly that she was raised by a man who managed his affairs with anger, and she didn't intend to ever submit herself to one again. Holmes watched as Henry ran a hand through his hair. I couldn't argue with that. I knew that controlling my temper wasn't something that I could do easily, and if it upset her that much, then marriage was indeed off the table. I was willing enough just to keep her as a friend, but like any good man, I wondered why her reaction was so severe. Then her father came to visit. He seemed nice enough, and I figured that any yelling he had done had been, like in my case, directed at others rather than his own family. Holmes, who was listening intently, interjected. But you were wrong. Henry let out a shuddering sigh. He seemed like a very kind man, invited me and Malinois with them on a hunting trip. It seems that Joe and he would always go out together to hunt, as his son didn't care for the pastime. We gladly accepted, went out all together, and at some point split up. Malinois and I bagged a couple of ducks, and we began to make our way back to them when we heard it. Screaming that would make most grown men quake in their boots, and enough profanity to make you assume that there was a sailor around. I assumed with the severity of it that he had shot himself, but just as we nearly got there, they came into sight. Malinois grabbed me and held me back. I watched Joe's father scream at his dead-eyed daughter about how he works so hard, and if she can't even do one simple little thing, he should just do everything himself. I wanted to jump from the bushes, but Malinois held me back and whispered a warning in my ear. If we come out now, she will only have it worse later. Play along. Henry shook his head in disgust and clenched his hands against his knees. He then made a noise to signal our approach, and her father's demeanor changed drastically, welcoming us back. Watson put on a false smile, and we returned to the town. I later told her what we had observed after her father left. When we asked her what had upset him, do you know what she said? He had bagged a deer, and when they were lifting it onto his mule, she dropped her end. I tell you, I wanted to end him then and there, but she only defended him, said that he had been under a lot of stress. The incident was indeed her own fault, and to not think poorly of him. Malinois and I left it alone, though I wasn't happy about it. It was only a few months later that Johanna finished her work and returned to Washington, and not too long after that, I sold the farm and enlisted. I tried not to think about it, Holmes. I really did. But I saw her eyes everywhere, in every soldier near death, in every one that had lost all hope, and it eventually struck me. Joe's been hopeless as long as I've known her. She hides it well, but she's lost the will to live. He stopped, silence filling the air for a moment, every muscle in his body stiff. It took the most horrifying war in all of history to snuff the light out of trained soldiers, and he killed his daughters before it even had a chance to burn. Holmes stoically listened until Henry finished his rant, then voiced his assessment. So that is why you were able to suddenly change your mood when you saw her face, despite your inebriation. Henry nodded. I'm many things, Holmes, but certainly not a man who enjoys torturing the spirit of a young woman. Holmes sat up with a comforting smile. You'll be glad to know, then, that I don't believe the spark of life has been quite put out in our dear Watson. She's been enjoying those cases that she has insisted on, and look here. He took a photograph from his pocket and presented it to Sir Henry, who looked upon the image, and with a relieved smile. It should please you to know that she was making baby talk to the puppies the entire time she was on the floor with them. You can keep it. I made several copies. Henry pocketed the picture with a laugh. "That is good to hear, but it doesn't change the fact that I drove the life from her face tonight, or rather this morning." He glanced at the large old grandfather clock that made soft thunking noises which filled the room, correcting his estimation. Had I known that such a fuss was being made over my emotional well-being by the two men, I likely would have slept even worse. As it was, while I fell asleep quickly due to my exhausted state, my upset and agitated mind was busy subjecting me to all the terrors that it was capable of conjuring up. Perhaps, fortunately, the only dream I could remember clearly was once more attempting to help someone in a pit, screaming for help, only for them to push my hands away. Mrs. Barrymore woke me around noon. "I'm sorry for disturbing you, Doctor, but Mr. Holmes wants to see you, and Sir Henry wouldn't let him come in and wake you himself." I thanked her and dressed myself before walking down to the breakfast table. Henry looked like a man who had consumed enough whiskey to give him alcohol poisoning, while Holmes looked fresh as a daisy. I lowered my voice to a pitch tenable for those who have over-imbibed. "Are you all right, Henry?" Henry gave a low groan, his head bent over the table, resting on it. "Have some hot water. It will help." I poured his teacup full from the pot, and he gingerly pulled it over to himself. Holmes was staring intently at the portrait of Hugo Baskerville, excitement in his eyes. I glanced at him before filling his cup from the teapot as well. "Holmes, do you have a plan for today?" He smiled at me and nodded. "I have a plan for the next 3 days, Watson, and it is important that we play it out perfectly. But for now," he paused, looking at the very strained Henry, "we rest." Henry was in a mood all the rest of that day, which was made worse by the fact that Holmes played his cards close. His irritation served to highlight his frayed nerves, and I began to grow worried. In my delight at being reunited with an old friend, I had not noticed just how worn and tired he really was. His emaciation was obvious, and one couldn't help but notice. But that wasn't anything a few months at home couldn't fix. I retired to my room to think and pray. Indeed, Henry had been shaky and focused. As I thought back upon our time at the Hall, I realized that Henry had been drinking much more than when I knew him back home. But then, hadn't I also changed? I glanced in the mirror and frowned at my appearance. I wasn't overly thin, my family being of a hardy stock, but I was definitely smaller than I ever had been before. I suppose the difference was because Henry had spent more time in the trenches than I, and, considering what had gone on in Italy, under far worse conditions than I had been. I decided to take down and brush my hair, as it would soothe my nerves. I had just gotten it down when there was a knock on the door. "Come in." Holmes came in quietly, shutting the door behind him gently. He glanced over at me and leaned against the wall. "You'll be all right, Watson. This will all be sorted quite soon, but in the meantime I have announced our return to London." I nearly dropped my brush in shock. "Return to London? Holmes, we can't!" My protest came out in a sharp whisper. I would not leave my friend to face the dangers that threatened him alone. Holmes gave me a smile that was mixed with what I can only assume was pity. "Ah, but Watson, we must. That is, the killer must believe we have. Henry, too, will follow us afterward." I knit my brow in confusion as my heartbeat slowed. Understanding came with a breath that I drew in deeply. "Oh, I see. You scared me. I suppose we will be lying in wait?" Holmes shook his head. "Not we, my dear Watson. Lestrade and I will be waiting, armed appropriately. By the way, that portrait of Hugo Baskerville is quite impressive, isn't it?" I was more insulted by his deflection of the subject rather than his inclination to exclude me, though I was indignant that he would send me out to protect Henry and then snatch that purpose away from me at the decisive moment. Just as quickly as the fires of anger sparked, however, they were put out by the waters of logic. I was weak and frail compared to the hale and hearty Holmes and Lestrade. They likely wouldn't have let Henry take part in the plan if he wasn't absolutely necessary for its success. I shook my head in resignation. "Very well." Holmes looked as though he were about to say something, then glanced down at the table, which held an envelope addressed to him. I followed his line of sight and gestured at it. "I wrote it last night before setting out with Mortimer. You may as well read it, in case I forgot to tell you anything." I returned to brushing out my hair and began to braid it. As lovely as the modern styles were, nothing is quite so functional and pretty as braids wrapped around the head. Holmes picked up the letter and glanced it over before frowning and pocketing it. "I did promise you a rest, Watson, but I'm afraid that is more for Sir Henry's sake than your own. We need to go out for a walk." I nodded and made to adjust my hair to something more presentable, only for Holmes to interrupt. No, that hairstyle suits you." Holmes had bustled me out of the room and into my coat and hat so fast that I hardly had time to breathe. He mentioned to Barrymore on our way out that he was taking me out for fresh air and grabbed my cane at the last second as we left. So bewildered was I as I was rushed out of the hall that I couldn't utter a word for several minutes after we left. Holmes had tucked my arm into his and walked at such a pace that I was hard-pressed to keep up. Finally he slowed. "I do apologize, Watson, but if we are to catch our quarry, then we had to hurry out of the hall." I gasped, a bit breathless. "It's fine, although a little warning would have been appreciated." I, still having no idea who our quarry was more than a little flustered at having been rushed out in an out-of-date hairstyle. I may have little care for ensuring that my clothes are in fashion, but I always did try to keep current with hairstyles. As we walked down the path toward Merripit House, I found myself wondering why Holmes' mood had changed so drastically. Before he had been relaxed, almost airy in his manner, and all of a sudden it had changed to something so serious. I thought carefully over what in my letter could have possibly made such a change and came through with nothing. I would have stayed lost and confused had not someone begun crying out my name. "Dr. Watson! Dr. Watson!" It was Stapleton with his ridiculous butterfly net. He was bounding across the moor, coming from the direction that Selden's body had been found. As Holmes and I paused to allow the man to catch up, Holmes seemed to relax, and I was preparing to question him as to why, when Stapleton made his way to us. "Ah, Dr. Watson, I'm so glad to have caught you. Beryl and I wanted to invite you and Sir Henry to dinner tomorrow night, but who is this?" He looked questioningly at Holmes. I blinked before responding, attempting to regain my composure. "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes, this is Jack Stapleton." Holmes smiled and held out his hand. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Mr. Stapleton." Stapleton shook his proffered hand vigorously. "Well, I'll be, Mr. Holmes. I have been wanting to meet you. I hear about you through the grapevine. Oh, yes, your exploits are well known. Mr. Franklin provides me with plenty of judicial gossip, and Sir Charles, bless his soul, knew of your brother. I've heard plenty. Surely you will join us for tea, won't you?" Holmes smiled and shook his head. "I would appreciate, Mr. Stapleton, if you would keep all that you know to yourself. If the criminal underbelly knew how I worked, then problems could arise. As for tea, I'm afraid it simply won't be possible. Watson and I are to return to London tonight. There is a case there for which I require her expertise. Sir Henry will be left in the capable hands of Mr. Barrymore, and then follow us in a week's time." Stapleton cocked his head sideways. "Sir Henry is to leave the moor? Why didn't he mention it?" Holmes smiled, his voice smooth. "It was only decided recently. It seems there's some work that must be attended to in London, and he said he may stay there for several months. Apparently, having no family here, he has decided to stay near Watson indefinitely until he finds someone to marry." Stapleton looked at me in surprise, and I smiled, lies flowing from my mouth as easily as water from a spout. "It may be more for my sake than his, I'm afraid. I think Henry has noticed how lonely I've been with no family here in England. Oh, but he will return to the Hall and finish the work Sir Charles started. It may just be a little while." Stapleton left us as hurriedly as he came, wishing us safe travels. During the conversation, I had finally realized what Holmes already knew and had been hinting at. The family resemblance is remarkable. Holmes and I returned to the hall to prepare for our departure. Henry, who had been informed of the plan, made a big show of seeing us off as we set about to leave, only to circle back on foot by cover of night. It was during this return that Holmes filled me in on the details of his plan. "It seems, Watson, that we must play our cards sooner than I'd hoped. Henry has been invited to Mr. Stapleton's for dinner tomorrow evening, and I fear that his murder is going to take place afterwards." I frowned. "And why not just stop him from going?" Holmes walked slowly and deliberately. "Because, dear Watson, we need more evidence. While I have pieced together enough of the puzzle to see the picture myself, we need more for the police." I nodded.
That made sense. And Lestrade has agreed to help you despite your circumstantial evidence? Holmes' face was strained for a moment. Lestrade is willing to do anything to prevent another member of the gentry from dying during a war. The plan was set to go as follows. Henry would go to dinner with the Stapletons. It seemed that the man would not make his move until after Henry left his home, while Lestrade and Holmes would lie in wait in the hills overlooking the path, to shoot the dog that would likely be set upon him. The plan didn't sit well with me. When I mentioned the growth of trees along the path, suggesting placing someone there, Holmes shrugged it off. Too risky, Watson. The timing would have to be perfect, whereas from the hills we will have more time to spot and aim. I bit my lip. But Holmes, shouldn't someone at least wait there, just in case? If you don't want me going out, maybe send Barrymore? Holmes smiled and placed his hand on my shoulder. Watson, I assure you that Lestrade and I both are more than capable with a rifle. We'll shoot the Hound, and Henry will be perfectly safe. I bit my lip harder, but nodded my assent. This was Dartmoor, not Washington or Canada. Holmes must surely be right. Part 18. The next night came all too soon. Henry left for dinner, and I saw him off with a smile. Holmes will have this all sorted out rather quickly, I think, Henry. Henry embraced me kindly and left, but I saw the strain in his eyes, felt the tensing of his shoulder, and began to ponder if maybe I shouldn't go against Holmes' instructions. Once more I attempted to explain my thoughts regarding the grove I had pointed out, but Holmes would have none of it, insisting that the best shot would be from the hills. I couldn't fault him there, if only the night stayed clear. He left to meet with Lestrade, and I watched the clock while biting my thumb. 8 became 8:30, and I sighed and put on my coat. I had made my decision and prayed that what I was about to do was entirely unnecessary. I knew that Holmes had asked the Barrymores to keep an eye on me, so I waited for them to do their rounds. Once I knew they were settled in at the back of the house, I made my way out, grabbing my cane and fingering my revolver. What followed was possibly the longest trek through the dark that I have ever made, of which I have made many. I eventually managed to reach the small grove that the road curved around. I leaned against a tree for support and took a few gasping breaths. My heart was beating wildly, and I knew I would need to calm my shaking limbs should I need to call upon them. The fog began to creep up toward the road, and I began to calm down. Perhaps they had already taken care of the Hound? I pulled out my pocket watch and, straining to see its face in the dim moonlight, I made out that it was 9:30, so I waited. It was 2 hours later when I began to feel stiff, cold, and rather silly. Holmes and Lestrade were capable men, and Henry wasn't so deteriorated as to need my protection from a physical threat. After all, I had really only been sent along to be a second pair of eyes. For a few moments I began to convince myself of my uselessness, preparing for the inevitable lecture when I returned to a worried but safe Henry and an irate Holmes at the hall. Then I heard it, a blood-curdling scream that filled the night, and it was coming in my direction. My heartbeat quickened once more, and I pulled my revolver out of my pocket. Snarls and gunshots were heard, and still Henry screamed. I knew that if I did not get this timing perfect, Henry would die. I prepared myself, and just as Henry ran past the trees I hid behind, I stepped out, pistol drawn and ready to shoot whatever demon chased him. I was not prepared for what I saw. Green glowing eyes and a smoking mouth bounded down upon me. In that moment I was once more upon the fields of Paschadale, men falling around me, gas and shells creating a living hell, and this creature its king. I was unable to run out into the middle of the road to shoot it head-on. Fortunately, it was unnecessary. I shot once, and the creature paused for a moment to look at me, snarling. I took a breath and fired. 1, 2, then 3 shots. The Hound bounded the space between us as I fired before stumbling and falling at my feet. I lowered my pistol and fired into its head, just like Father taught me. Never assume a predator is dead. Always make certain. I froze for a moment, taking in a breath before turning and walking away. I needed to find Henry. One step, then another. Where had I put my cane? I no longer had it. I tried to call for Henry, but my voice was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my wrist, and I whipped around to see Holmes' face white and tense. "Henry!" I had found my voice. "Henry, where is he?" Lestrade ran ahead of us and shouted, "I found him! He's collapsed, but he's unharmed." Holmes helped me over to Henry, who Lestrade was reviving with a few well-placed slaps. Lestrade looked up at Holmes. "We'll have the boys take them back to the hall." Henry and I were not present for what happened next, being taken to Baskerville Hall by some constabulary who were somehow scrounged up for the job. Holmes and Lestrade made their way to Merripit House, where no one was to be found. As they searched the house, they found Miss Stapleton, bound and gagged in the cellar. She was angry, hatred in her eyes. "I will show you where he went." It was later revealed that Miss Stapleton was in fact Mrs. Stapleton, though it was unclear as to why her husband thought the ruse a good idea. She did show Holmes where her husband had gone, though it was pointless. In his panic to escape to safety, the man had slipped into the mire in very nearly the same place Lestrade had come close to. She eventually gave some explanation to Holmes and the police after all was said and done. "I was done with him. I loved him once, but he was no longer the man I married. He flirted with everything, and right in front of me, too. I was going to tell Sir Henry the truth, but he did this to me." Lestrade and Holmes concluded that this was better left off the books, and that the lost Baskerville heir would remain lost. While this was going on, Henry and I were returned to the hall, where the Barrymores waited on us. Neither of us were in good shape. As we sat with our chairs facing the grate fire, I could feel it coming over me. All of the panic and dread of the night that should have affected me in the moment. Already I was incapable of speech, lost again in the mire of the trenches. I had fought every instinct I had to keep Henry safe. My mind replayed that moment over and over, seeing the Hound and feeling how desperately I wanted to duck behind the safety of my tree when I heard the gunshots. I took a deep breath. I could no longer fight it. I needed cover. I shifted quickly out of my chair and under the grand oak table. Henry caught a glimpse of my movement and instinctively followed suit, joining me in a huddle under the table where we hid from the shells that existed only for the two of us. At some point I lost consciousness, and I awoke to Henry's distant but crystal-clear roaring voice the next morning. My heart sped up, but I slowly made my way out of my room and into the hall. I briefly realized that someone must have put me to bed, then noticed Mrs. Barrymore outside the door of Henry's office. She saw me and shook her head fiercely. "Miss, you don't want to go in there." I brushed past her anyway and opened the door to the room where the window-rattling screaming was the loudest. "What in hell's name were you thinking, not taking Joanna? She could have been killed!" Holmes seemed unfazed by Henry's thunderous volume and tensed muscles. "Watson was supposed to stay here at the hall. She wouldn't have been in any danger had she done so." Henry's fist clenched, and for a moment I feared he would attack Holmes. "And it's a damned good thing she didn't, or I'd be dead! Wasn't that the whole point of sending her out here with me?" I decided to intervene, my voice barely breaking a whisper. "Henry." Henry turned like he'd been shot. "Joe!" His voice was sharp. "You need to go." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "No, Henry, I don't think I will. He didn't know. It's my fault for not insisting I went with him." Henry's face went red again, but he clenched his fist and took a deep breath. "It's his job to know things, Joe. You could have died because of his negligence." I pursed my lips tightly. "If I died, it would have been because I went against his express orders, Henry." "No!" Henry exploded and turned once more to Holmes. "I told him that you were the greatest shot I've ever seen. You!" He shoved his fingers into Holmes' chest. "You put my life and Joe's at risk. And for what? If she had been on the hill with you, the wolf would have been taken down in one shot. Some detective you are!" Henry's volume made my vision blur, and I winced. Seeing this, he stormed out of the room, not waiting for an answer. Holmes and I were left alone in the room, and I brought my hands together, picking at my fingers. "It seems I've done you a disservice, Mr. Holmes." Holmes sharply brought his eyes to mine as I spoke. I couldn't tell you exactly why I spoke to him the way I did, only that I felt as though I were speaking with a stranger. My unwillingness to speak of my past has brought us to an uncomfortable present." Holmes just stared at me, his face grim, and said,
"No, Watson. I misjudged the situation."
Confused, I brought my eyes back to his as he sat down into a chair.
"I decided that it would be best to protect you. You haven't had much of a chance to practice your marksmanship since coming to England, and I came to the erroneous conclusion that with your still weakened state, Lestrade and I were better marksmen. If you hadn't gone with your gut, Sir Henry would indeed be dead."
I looked at him, the silence deafening. "But I didn't tell you."
Holmes held up his hand to stop me. "You did try to protest, and Sir Henry told me you regularly went deer hunting with your father, in a region that is notorious for large wildcats, which I conclude you were trained to deal with?" His eyes flicked up to mine, and I nodded in response. "I made a grave error, Watson. I don't plan on making one again."
I furrowed my brow in confusion. "But if you were so worried for my safety, then why did you not simply have one of the constables wait where I did?" Holmes' gray eyes were steady and fierce, staring me down intensely.
"Watson, the constabulary is generally incompetent, and certainly aren't the best of shots on a good day. Do you really think one of them could have done what you did?"
I blinked in confusion, and the man sighed.
"Watson, your timing was impeccable. A mistake of timing or missed shot could have resulted in one of two things: either the dog completely ignoring you and continuing after Henry, or the dog attacking in the same manner it attacked you. We examined its body and found only 2 bullet wounds. Being accustomed to large wildcats, you were apparently unfazed by the beast's attack. No man in the constabulary has had that kind of experience. It would have been completely useless for anyone but you to be in that position." It's hard not to feel some modicum of pride upon being told that you are the only person capable of an important job, even if you are being told in hindsight. I almost smiled until I remembered that Henry might have died. "It seems Henry's not very happy with you." Holmes gave a wry smile. "And rightly so, Watson."
I sank into the chair next to Holmes, and he surprised me with his next words.
"It might be wise for you to stay here."
I whipped my head to look at him.
"What?"
Holmes took out his pipe, lighting it. He almost seemed agitated.
"Sir Henry has just been through a terrible ordeal. I'm certain Dr. Mortimer will be a good friend to him, yet I can't help but feel that Henry could use an old friend. At least here you don't have to worry about constant danger."
I cocked my head to the side, then laughed.
"Right, Holmes, that's a good idea. 2 shell-shocked soldiers in the middle of nowhere with nothing to keep them distracted."
Holmes raised a brow at my sarcasm. "Besides, while Henry is a dear friend, and I love him, I think I'm better off around you." Once more I had let my guard down. I had become comfortable around Holmes, perhaps too comfortable. I cursed myself inwardly as Holmes' face took on a distorted expression that I did not recognize. All of Holmes' facial expressions were subtle and hard to read, but this, I was convinced, must be discussed. "And I want to stick around for Mary's labor. The birth of a child is quite a healing experience, and I rather think it would be good for me." Holmes simply smiled at this. The return to London was a quiet one, in part because Henry came with us. Dr. Mortimer had come to speak with Henry, and like me was rather concerned about the state of his nervous health. He insisted that Henry go to a small coastal town and get some rest somewhere things would be peaceful. Henry responded to this by saying that he'd had more than enough of peaceful country life and would return to London where I could keep an eye on him. I knew well it was so he could keep an eye on me. So Henry came to London, but he had decided that he would refuse to speak to Holmes for the time being. Instead, he spent the trip sullenly brooding in the corner of the train compartment, while I sat next to Holmes on the opposite seat. This would be my life for some time into the future, dealing with a sullen man until I would be rescued by an angel.